Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1966. I remember the year so remarkably well. It was the illustrious Chinese year of the fire horse that occurs only once in a 60-year cycle. And there was a noteworthy celebrated newspaper article in the paper that read the following: "This is not just your stereotype customary year. This is the year of the fire horse. And much like the name suggests, there is nothing ambiguous or prevailing about this momentous, exceptional year that lies ahead of us with an inviting, mysterious intrigue. The free-spirited assertiveness of the firehorse will have momentous implications on all of us, as a distinguished year that will not go by unnoticed. Indeed, its imperishable, unfading memory will almost undoubtedly leave an indelible impact on our lives and invoke us to make choices and decisions this year on impulse that will serve our best spiritual needs. For the firehorse dives into situations without reluctance and disengages all doubt and trepidation. So some of your moments of bodacious courage and your most innovative, electrifying ideas will be birthed in this year, which will bring about fruit for the generations to come." I remember reading the article to my mother, who pooh-poohed it. Why was I surprised about this? My mother was the world's greatest cynic, who doubted everything beyond what you could actually see physically. So something as fanciful and far-fetched as horoscopes, especially Chinese ones, was not something that floated her boat by any manner of means, or could be really trusted. "Oh, for goodness sake, Logan, please don't tell me you buy into all that redundant nonsense. I'm sure this year is going to be much like any other year. They only write all this stuff to keep us entertained. It's called being industrious and conservative with the truth." "I don't know, Mum," I say. "I rather like the idea of it being the year of the fire horse. It sounds exciting, progressive, dramatic, if you ask me. And by all accounts, the Chinese take this stuff awfully seriously. They've done so for thousands of years, you know." "So what are you saying, Logan?" says my mother, who's piling the dirty dishes into the aluminium's kitchen sink and soaking them in the soapy hot water, almost flinching as the hot water burns her hands. She gasps as she pulls her burnt hand from the water. "Ouch! Ouch! All this talk about fire! I've just scorched my hand. Oh, it's burning really badly. Maybe you're right. It is going to be a hot year. In more ways than one," she chuckles. "Boy, that was hot." I remember thinking to myself that the firehorse was going to be a year that almost certainly impacted my life. Because regardless of what my mother's scathing rebuffed comments were, I had a profound, deep guttural sense that this poignant year I would never forget. And I was later to discover that my impressions were on the money, as 1966 was an evocative year that I would never, ever forget. It was the summer holidays, and I was looking for all kinds of odd jobs to undertake in order to make some much-needed money. I was an assiduous, rather industrious 18-year-old kid who liked to be kept busy all the time. Over the last 5 years, I had studiously built up a sizable savings account by devoting my free time to painstakingly mowing people's lawns, painting house interiors and exteriors, washing windows and cars. I even took up a part-time job at the grocer's where I stocked shelves. I was asking around town if anyone knew what jobs were going in Montana that paid well. I was eager to save enough money to buy myself a red Ford Bronco, and when I had my mind set on something, I'd stop at nothing to attain my goal, even if it meant working my butt off in order to bring it into fruition. My father always used to say to me, if you want something badly enough, you would always get it if you worked hard enough for it, and really believed in the object of your attainment. I had heard from a friend of mine, a girl called Lisa Duckworth, that there was a woman who lived on the outskirts of a small rural town here in Montana, who was looking for someone to babysit her 14-year-old daughter, her 2 cats and a dog, while she went away. I saw the sign on the window of the diner in the small town there, she told me. I took down the details. I was thinking of taking the job myself, you see. But I can't now, she said, scrunching her face up in disappointment. We're going to Florida for the holidays, so I can't do it. Or you can bet your bottom dollar I would not be telling you about it, that's for sure. Why are you looking so downcast, Lisa? I said. You lucky bugger. I wish my parents were taking me on a beach holiday, somewhere lovely and sunny. But you look as if someone's told you that your funeral is on Monday. I'm just disappointed, Logan, that's all, she says gingerly. I'm just like you. I have my eyes on saving up for an Austin Morris, so I'm hardly going to be making money swimming in the ocean, luxuriating on the beach. I'll be spending all my savings frivolously on ice cream, sun hats and little souvenirs. I'm good at saving money, Logan, very good, but I'm even better at spending it. That's my quintessential problem. I acquired the dreadful habit from my mother. She's the spender in our household. My father is the saver. So I've inherited both of their traits. I'm perpetually at war with myself, as the saver within me wants to sabotage the spender, and vice versa. You could try and be frugal. Cut back on all the spending while you're away. Are you kidding, Logan? When I go on holiday, part of enjoying myself is spending money. That makes the holiday so much more fun. Still, when I get back, I'll have to work twice as hard to save up for the car of mine that I'm longing to buy. I'm going to get that Austin Morris. Do you hear me? I'm going to get it. I hear you, and I believe you. I'm sure you will, I say. Suffice to say, the job Lisa saw in the window of the diner, in that small rural town, not far away from where I actually lived, was up my street. It promised to pay handsomely, and the thing that appealed to me the most was I would live in, so I would have the independence that I craved. The thought of spending the summer holidays with my mother's beady eye hovering over me all the time was not pleasing to me. I'd always enjoyed my own company, and the idea of taking this job sounded very agreeable, especially if it paid well. My friend gave me the contact details of Mrs. Stoneheart. I seriously hoped that her unyielding surname was not going to be as hard-hearted as the woman herself. In my gut, I felt almost certain that the job was actually mine. That was if I wanted it. It seemed I wasn't wrong, as no one appeared to be beating down her door to get that job. The house was nothing like I was expecting, but then again, I'm not sure what I was actually anticipating. It was a double-storey, very robust, full-flavoured building that was easy on the eye. Houses here in Montana need to be exceedingly well built to withstand the harsh, cruel elements of nature's seasonal weather, which can certainly cause issues with leaking roofs or rotting wood. The understated home was as sturdy and strong as you could get, but its secure, muscular structure did not diminish the house's aesthetic appeal or arresting features. I think whoever designed it had a creative eye. The Mellow house was simple, but fastidious attention was devoted to the unassuming details of its construction that was so elusively subtle that it wasn't obvious, rather like a woman wearing a refined makeup, who looks like she's wearing no makeup at all. It was perfectly symmetrical, not too big nor too small, nestled gracefully on stone foundations. It was built out of brick and mortar, painted white with a large sloping grey slate roof to ensure that snow and water could slip down the eaves easily. I liked the fact that the house had magnanimous white wooden sash windows, so that the outside would welcome its wholesome views into the house. The rear of the property was hugged generously by a wooden deck wrap-around porch that had been well maintained over the years. The white house nuzzled the viridescent valley, and was intimidated by the tall, undulating sweeps of the mountains that arrested the background. They stood up, lofty and proud, harnessing their splendiferous contours into the cobalt blue sky, with a pompous, regal audacity. The sprawling meadows were elegantly dominated by a plethora of bright pink Californian larkspurs, which gracefully covered the meadows in a disorganized, tangled confetti of pink petals, while rocky outcrops burst through the knee-high grass like pleasing sculptural masterpieces that reminded you of the voluptuous shapes of Rubenesque women, often depicted in the great artworks of Peter Paul Rubens in 1577. The meadow was richly embellished with a scattering of alpine trees that sanguinely fringed its border with an intrepid serenity and a sure-footed repose. These imposing trees penciled up and spread-eagled themselves into the sky in long vertical sweeps, with boughs bedecked and adorned with needled tassels. I had parked my brother's truck on the white sandy driveway at the edge of the meadow, where a slim curvaceous path winded its way through the field of pink that led directly to an overhanging portico, which arched gracefully over the gleaming pale blue front door, with its shiny gold horseshoe knocker. I noticed either side of the door was serenaded by terracotta pots containing tall lollipop rose bushes, with rounded heads ablaze with trailing red roses. As I made my approach to the door, it was quickly swung open by a woman in her 40s, who looked rather delicate, her porcelain skin so white, her features refined. In truth, it was almost impossible to believe that this woman had ever stepped out into the Montana sun a day in her life, and if indeed she did, she must have always worn the hugest sun hat to have such a peachy, almost perfect skin. She had a delicate quality about her, rather like the alpine flowers in the valley, that could so easily snap if you severed them under one of your boots. I would say that although there was a distinctive vulnerability to this woman, there was also a stoic strength in her demeanour, which I could see very clearly in her determined blue eyes. This longanimous woman did not wear her heart on her sleeve, but clandestinely obviously buried her feelings, rather like a squirrel hiding away its stash of acorns. I got a sense that this gentlewoman was hiding an indelible hurt. I was to learn later on in life that my instinctive impressions of her were bang on the money. "Come this way," she said. She was wearing such a floaty dress that splashed gracefully above her slender ankles. She beckoned for me to sit down on a comfortable upholstered chair in her well-appointed living room that was sheltered gracefully beneath high ceilings, an elegant chandelier, and directly opposite a grand fireplace framed by a marble mantel. "I'm so glad you've come, Logan," she said, looking at me with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "In truth, I've had absolutely no response to the advert I left in the diner window. I really was beginning to think I'd have to postpone the trip. My sister's ill, I'm afraid. She lives in Philadelphia, so I need to stay with her for a while, just to help her through this challenging time that she's going through." "I'm sorry to hear that. That's bad news," I say. "It is, but the doctor says the prognosis is good. I'm sure you can appreciate that when someone in your family is sick, they need all the support they can get. So I need to spend a couple of weeks with her, and that's why I need someone like you to hold things together for me while I'm away. Do you think you could do that?" "Of course. I'm very glad to help," I say. "In your ad, you said you'd be paying handsomely." "Indeed I will. But before you jump in the deep end, Logan, and agree to this arrangement with me, I need to know if you can take on this job, whether you're up to the challenges it demands." "Well, it's not difficult," I say. "I assume you want me to look after 2 cats and a dog, and a 14-year-old girl. I mean, how complicated can that be?" The woman pauses for a moment. "That's absolutely right. I'm not actually worried about my cats or my dog." she tells me. Indeed, you look like a responsible young man to me. But it's my 14-year-old daughter I'm worried about. She's a real handful, I'm afraid. It's just she's getting to that age when she's not afraid to use her tongue like a sandblaster, and her words can be exceedingly abrasive. I mean, my daughter has no filter. She has no ability to tame her tongue. She'll tell you exactly what she thinks and damn the consequences. It seems as soon as she turned 13, a switch was flicked on in her, and gone was the nice, sweet, unassuming girl, to be replaced by, how can I put it, a combustible ball of fire. I gather at school she's upset so many of the pupils. The headmistress has actually called me in twice to discuss my daughter's unruly, insubordinate behaviour with me. What I'm trying to say to you, Logan, is that provided that you've got the hide of a rhino, the job is almost certainly yours. My daughter could literally break you down and give you a hard time. She can be out of control, I say, finishing her sentence for her. Yes, Logan, exactly that, out of control, like a wildfire that cannot be tamed. I think I can cope with a disagreeable 14-year-old. I've grown up with 2 sisters. They've taught me a lot. Believe me, they can spit some nasty stuff out of their mouths from time to time. I'm used to girls like that. Mrs. Stoneheart looks relieved. That's settled then. The job is yours. I need to introduce you to Bagel. He's half Great Dane and Bull Mastiff, she says, opening the kitchen door, so a larger-than-life dog comes bounding out of the kitchen and eagerly greets me with a wagging tail and sniffs me curiously. Hello, boy, I say to the dog, giving him a big cuddle. Mrs. Stoneheart watches me cuddle her big dog. He's a sensitive dog, very well behaved. He was joined at the hip to my husband, you know, she says, flushing. Where is your husband? I ask her. Oh, he went missing one day a couple of years ago. Never been seen since, I'm afraid. We had a bit of a stormy altercation, you see. You know how it is. He left me a note, told me he was never coming back, and that was that. Oh, I'm very sorry, Mrs. Stoneheart. I didn't mean to pry. I had absolutely no idea. Don't be, she says, wiping away a tear that trickles down her face. It is what it is, you know. Things happen in life, don't they? Things that can't ever be changed or undone. It's like every day we live our lives, we're writing a chapter of a book. And one day, when we finally leave this planet, our book is completed, our own exclusive edition. Wow, that's rather a good analogy. I never thought about our lives like that. We're all writing our own exclusive copies. Something like that. Now let's see, she says, pointing to the deep freezer. I've got loads of frozen meals in here, neatly labelled. You just need to take them out of the freezer the day before. Then you pop them in the oven at 180 degrees Fahrenheit to warm up, and Bob's your uncle. I've written down what food to give the cats and dogs. I'll make an arrangement with the grocers to drop bread, milk and some baked goods to the house every other day. Now let's see. Let me show you your bedroom. It's upstairs, and of course I need to introduce you to the cats. This is Cinnamon. And this is his sister Spice. His sister Spice is very gentle, but Cinnamon is a little bit more feisty, she said to me when we'd entered the upstairs bedroom, with a queen-size bed covered in a spectacular emerald green duvet cover that emulated the prepossessing verdant views of the countryside. There was a generous sunlight streaming through the room, casting its pretty light shadows over the oakwood furnishings. I glanced out of the window and could see the big goofy dog I'd met moments before, lying underneath a large oak tree, scratching the ground up with his claws. What's he doing? I ask. Oh, Bagel's a bit of a digger, says Mrs. Stoneheart. He's fixated about that particular spot under the oak tree. He likes to park himself there all day. If you can't find him, that's where he'll be. Strange behaviour for a dog. Both the Stoneheart cats were comfortably curled up together in a cosy heap, like a large puddle of brown fur, on the luxurious bed, basking on the resplendent emerald green cover, like seals sunning themselves on the ocean's sand. The cats stirred for a moment when I began to stroke their sleek, smooth coats, their green eyes studying me judiciously, as if to say, who the hell is this? Both of the cats were chocolate in colour, with the distinctive characteristics of Siamese cats. I run my hands again down their silken fur, and they begin to immediately purr. They're beautiful, aren't they? We found them on our doorstep in a cardboard box 7 years ago, would you believe it? We rescued them. We never looked back. They've become great characters in our household, I have to say. Do you like this room, Logan? She asks me. It's beautiful. I love the views out there. Good. It is the room with the best views in the house, I have to say. I thought it could be yours. The cats will definitely be sleeping in here with you. They love this room. I can see why. With the curtains drawn, it's pleasingly sunny. If I was a cat, I would gravitate here myself. They clearly have great taste. Come with me, says Mrs. Stoneheart, and brace yourself for impact, she warns. I need to introduce you to Simone. She leads me further down the passage to a room where I could hear loud music blasting away, and the words, "I can't get no satisfaction," from the Rolling Stones being played on the radio. Mrs. Stoneheart knocks politely on the door. I can see she looks a little apprehensive. Sweetheart! Sweetheart, may I come in, please? What do you want, Mum? Comes a booming voice. Can't you see I'm busy? Why don't you just leave me alone? I've got someone I need you to meet, sweetheart, says Mrs. Stoneheart. May I please come in? Why bother asking, Mum? You'll come in anyway, won't you? You always do, comes a capricious, belligerent voice. Mrs. Stoneheart opens the door reluctantly, and a young 14-year-old girl is seen lying across her bed, with her legs and feet curled up from the knees, while her head is perched over bent elbows as she's paging through a large book. I notice the walls of her room are covered in posters, some of Gary Grant, the Hollywood heartthrob in movies like The Magnificent Obsession and Pillow Talk, and then there were posters of Bobby Sherman and Robert Wagner. The pugnacious 14-year-old girl has pale skin much like her mother, but that is where the similarity begins and ends. Her bob-dark hair is as dark as a raven's feathers, and her brown eyes are the colour of chocolate, heavily lined with a black coal. She has almost got a goth but very unorthodox look about her, and is dressed in black jeans and a dark sweater. She could be pretty if she smiled, but the girl gives me and her mother a big scowl, as her lips curl downwards into a huge smirk. This is Logan, sweetheart. He's going to be looking after you while I'm away. Mum, I'm not a baby. I don't need anybody looking after me. Do I look like I need anybody looking after me? I'm perfectly able to look after myself, she says obsequiously. You do need someone looking after you, sweetheart. You really do. You're not as mature as you think you are. You can be a loose cannon at the very best of times. How old are you, Logan? Asked Simone defiantly. I'm 18 years old. Mum, he's only 4 years older than me, and you expect me to take orders from him? Are you kidding me? I'm not going to be bullied by an 18-year-old. Never. You'll do as I say, Simone. Logan is grown up. You're still very young, and you'll listen to him. Do you understand? I want you to be very nice to him while he's staying in this house. Do you get my drift? I'm sorry, Mum, but I don't want a stranger in this house with me. I told you I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself. Do I look like I'm a baby? This is Montana, for goodness sake. There are no criminals running amok over here. It's safe here, Mum. You overreact. You always overreact. I know, Simone. It's safe here in Montana. I agree with you. But I'm sure your mother wants peace of mind for you. I don't want to interfere with your fun. I assure you of that. But I will be here for you manning the fort. That's what your mother wants for you. She wants to feel that you'll be taken care of while she's away. The good news is I'll heat up our meals for us, feed the dogs and the cat, so you won't have to worry about those daily practicalities. And surely that's a good thing for you. Whatever. As long as you leave me alone. Do you understand that? Then we'll get on okay. Now please go, the both of you. Leave me alone. I told you she's a handful, says Mrs. Stoneheart. If her father were here, he'd tow her into line, I assure you. But sadly that's not to be. Every daughter needs a father figure in their life. I think I've allowed her to get away with her outrageous behaviour, probably out of my guilt that her father's not here. I give in to her more than I should. So are you still keen on the job after having met the volatile storm cloud, my daughter? Absolutely, Mrs. Stoneheart. I think I can handle her. I've seen far worse. You have no idea how grateful I am to hear that, Logan. I'll leave you my contact details so you can call me should the need arise."
"I'm sure that won't be necessary, Mrs. Stoneheart."
And so it was I moved into the Stoneheart household for 2 weeks of my summer holidays. Let's just say there was no love lost between me and Simone. She was an obstreperous, quarrelsome teenager who was mutinously at war with the world and possibly herself. Definitely with herself, with refractory hormones shooting up all over the place like a powerful waterfall. She'd barely acknowledge me, and whenever she did, she gave me a contemptuous scowl and a belligerent glare. She would seditiously thunder off to her bedroom, with the meals on a tray, which she would dump into the kitchen for me to clean up after she'd finished. She barely gave me the time of day, but I didn't care. I knew that Simone had her own issues, and whatever they were nothing to do with me. I was also certain that some of her combative indignance had risen from her father abandoning her home 2 years prior. That was not easy for any daughter to comfortably digest or to willingly accept, least of all a petulant, rather hawkish teenager who could fly off the handle if you merely mentioned her name. I was thoroughly enjoying the solitude of the countryside, and if Simone wanted to lock herself away in her bedroom, listening to Elvis Presley, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones, then she could do just that. She was welcome. I would not take offence to her idiosyncratic behaviour. I thoroughly enjoyed taking my sketchbook out into the countryside, drawing charcoal pictures of the flowers, plants, animals and birds I encountered. It had been absolute ages since I'd found the time to pursue my pastime, as I was always working so hard. But now indulging my passions and being paid for it in the process was like having my Christmases all at once. I noticed Simone would regularly entertain her giggling girlfriends. 2 of them. They'd both come to her bedroom and hang out with her all day, and often stay for the night. They would thunder behind her up the sweeping staircase and be swept into her bedroom, where they would slam the door behind them. I'd often hear the music blasting away, sometimes throughout the night. I'd hear mumbling voices, excited chatter, and always a plethora of giggles. Simone's account, the 29th of May 1966. When Logan moved into our farmhouse while my mother was away for the summer break, I was exceedingly annoyed. I was an obnoxious teenager. I admit that. I was furious with the world and pretty much hated almost everyone, with the exception of my 2 friends, who were on exactly the same page as me, suffering from the same teenage hang-ups and tribulations as I was. I think we were troubled souls, raised by single parents who had an axe to grind, as we didn't have father figures in our lives to help soften the hardness in our unyielding hearts that seemed to have grown a layer of moss over them, to block out the hurt and shelter us from the storms of life. I think reacting with anger was like a defensive mechanism for us, much like the black ink spurted out by an octopus in self-defense. Our black ink was our capricious energy, which certainly succeeded in keeping people at bay, who would walk on eggshells to accommodate our inflamed moods. I know my mother always would. We were all hurting, even though we didn't know how to articulate or express those feelings, but somehow on an unconscious level, we knew we were connected together by the same sorry woes. I emphatically believed that if our fathers had been present in our lives, we would have been much more well-adjusted teenagers and would have possibly been all-round more amenable people. Instead, we felt a sense of abandonment, as all our fathers were estranged from our lives. All I knew was that my beloved father suffered from a crippling physical pain after a nasty riding accident that occurred in the fall of 1962. But suddenly he vanished from my life on the 30th of October, 1964. My mother showed me the note my father left us, telling us he was going for good and didn't want to be found, as he couldn't take the fighting any longer. I thought it was exceedingly bizarre, as I don't recall a single time my parents ever had a fight, and I can honestly say they loved the bones off each other. So something about this paradoxical mystery was off. I knew my mother knew more than she was actually saying. She was exceedingly evasive and just said that she and my father had parted ways after this fight. My mother registered him as a missing person. I don't think the police were very concerned. They believed my father had just buggered off into the sunset and wasn't coming back any time soon, and that was that. No questions were asked.
"Who is that rather handsome boy I saw in the kitchen washing up your dishes?"
My friend asks me. I thought you said we'd have this place to ourselves when your mother went away. At least he's working like a dog. Honestly, what are you like, letting him clean up after you like this? I kind of feel quite sorry for him. I'd hate to be your slave. It's a bummer, I know. It is what it is, I say. But at least he cleans up the dirty dishes and reheats the meals for me. I just couldn't persuade my mother to leave me in the house unsupervised. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's only about 4 years older than us. But Mum insists I can't be here alone. It's absolutely pathetic. He's quite good looking, says my other friend Jennifer, who had an eye for the boys. I like my men older. He looks a lot like Johnny Cade, I think. Same dark hair and sultry eyes. He's rather hot. We're 14. He's 18, I remind her. I bet you he thinks we're just babies. My mother says there's a big difference between the maturity of a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old. Believe you me, he acts like he thinks I'm a silly little kid. Anyway, the great news is I think he'll leave us alone. In truth, I think he's a wee bit intimidated by me. I give him that look, and he shrinks away. Well, it's cool at least that he lets us sleep over. Your mother would never have agreed to that. So I suppose we should be grateful for small mercies, however small they may be. So is everyone up for it then? Asks my friend Jennifer, looking at us both. Katie shrugs her shoulders awkwardly. I'm still a bit scared. You know, I've heard stories. I pull out the large black box from under my bed and open it. We pull out the Ouija board and just stare at it. Oh, come on, says Jennifer. I wish you weren't such a prude, Katie. I mean, what harm can it actually do? The pastor of our church says we shouldn't play with Ouija boards. It can open up portals, invite demons, Katie insists. Oh, come on. Don't be so melodramatic, Katie, says Jennifer. I mean, look at this thing. It's just like a Monopoly board, isn't it, with letters on it, that's all, and a heart-shaped planchette. It's not like we're using a book of black magic, are we, to conjure up demons? That's called invoking, you know, and we're not doing that, are we? We're just going to see if we can speak to the dead. Go on, it'll be great fun. In truth, it's probably a hype all about nothing. But why should we worry? Ouija boards have outsold Monopoly boards of late. Everybody is doing it. So if there really is something to worry about, people everywhere would be complaining about the boards. You'd be hearing about it on the radio. My bet is it's a harmless game. Oh, all right, says Katie. I'll give it a go. But promise me one thing. We will stop the game if it gets scary, or if anything funny or untoward happens. We promise, says Jennifer. I promise too, I say. I open up my board. My bed is so large that we can all lie across it with our fingers pressed on the blanchette. Is there anyone there? I ask. The blanchette immediately moves, and the pointed tip focuses on the yes. Were you moving the blanchette? I ask my friends. No, I wasn't, says Jennifer. Nor was I, said Katie. We didn't move it. Is there anyone here with us? I repeat the question. The blanchette immediately goes to yes. What is your name? I ask. The blanchette begins to spell A-N-G-U-S. Angus! My blood runs cold. Angus is the name of my father. Angus, are you my father? I ask. The blanchette immediately goes to yes, straight away, without any doubt. Are you dead? I ask, my heart pounding in my chest. Dad, are you dead? My girlfriends give me astonished looks. I don't understand, says my friend Katie. Your dad left home after a fight with your mother. He's not dead, surely not. The blanchette goes to yes, and then it begins to spell out the letters D-E-A-D. Again it repeats D-E-A-D. And again D-E-A-D. It's spelling out dead. Dad, where is your body buried? I ask. The blanchette begins to spell O-A-K. New word, T-R-E-E. Oak tree. Who killed you, Daddy? The Blanchette begins to spell out my mother's name. D-O-R-E-E-N. That's my mother's name. Me and my friends look at each other nonplussed. It's not true. Don't worry, Simone. Don't believe what it says my friend Jennifer. Your mother may be many things, but she's not a murderer, and I can tell you that for a fact. She'd have never harmed your dad. At this revelation, I'm so discomposed. I honestly don't know what to think. I've had enough, I say. I think we should stop playing this game. Well, the Ouija board was lying, says Katie. To our amazement, after Katie's reassuring comments, my bedside clock rolls forward on the nightstand. It flies up into the air, where it remains airborne for a couple of minutes, as if someone is holding it, and then it violently crashes to the floor, as bits of glass spatter across my bedroom carpet, while the Blanchette is spelling out, Angus dead, murdered. None of us are touching the Blanchette. It's moving all on its own. We sit around the board, absolutely terrified. There is a thick, clawing energy in the bedroom. Me and my girlfriend stare at each other in bewilderment. I close the board, folding it up, replacing it into the black box. I gather up the broken pieces of my clock, which I quickly discard into the wastepaper basket. "Oh, my God!" says Katie, clasping her hands over her mouth. "Did you see what happened there? Did you see it? Your bedside clock. It moved on its own on the nightstand, and then it was as if someone was holding it in the air. And then they threw it onto the ground, and it smashed into hundreds of pieces. And the Blanchette, did you see the Blanchette? It moved on its own accord. It insists your dad is dead, Simone. Oh, my God! I can feel there's someone here with us. I can feel it. Can't you sense the energy has changed in this room? It feels all heavy. What if we've conjured up a demon? Who was making all those terrible lies up about your mother? My pastor at the church, he says that demons always lie. They make up all kinds of lies. I told you we shouldn't have played that game. I told you, but you wouldn't listen. Now look what we've done." "No need to overreact," says Jennifer. "All we need to do is pray. And this thing, whatever it is, it'll have to go. It has to listen to prayers. It can't stay around any word of God. It has to leave." I will confess, I was very startled by what had happened in my bedroom, and I was heartily glad that my girlfriends were with me and were sharing my queen-size bed with me that night, as the thought of spending the night alone in my bedroom was very intimidating. We immediately brought out a Bible and prayed St. Michael's prayer of protection, and the heavy ambience lifted and the atmosphere changed dramatically. It was so remarkable. Even I was astounded, not only by the power of prayer, but it was also in that moment I became aware that there really is a spiritual realm. Before this point, I didn't believe that there was a heaven or hell, or even life after death. I had always believed that people of faith clung on to these incredulous ideas, as it made them feel less aggrieved about the dying process, and offered them comfort that this life was not all there is, so that death itself was diluted in its daunting austere finality, as there was a hope to be gleaned, which was why people gravitated towards religion, as most people don't want to face the possibility that once we die, we just go up in smoke and cease to exist. As I lay in bed that night, I pondered about the answers on the Ouija board. Could there be any truth to what revelations it had conveyed? My mother had murdered my father, and he was buried under the oak tree. My father had disappeared from my life 2 years ago, and ever since his disappearance, our dog Bagel had acted strangely, always hanging around under the oak tree and digging up the ground there with his paws. Bagel had been so close to my dad in life. Was he resting over his remains to feel close to him in death? It seemed so far-fetched, way too far-fetched to believe. I kept telling myself that there was no way my mother could have killed my father, as my parents loved each other so very much. I could not imagine my mother ever hurting a single hair on my father's head. Indeed, when my mother informed the police that she and my dad had had an altercation together, no one was more surprised than I was. as my parents never ever fought. My mother showed me the note written by my dad, saying he'd had enough after all the bickering, and he was leaving for good. He didn't want to ever be found. It had been the most distressing note I'd ever read, devastating me to the very core of my being. Was my dad ever going to come back home? And why had he and my mother fought? I was not privy to witnessing any discord between the two of them. None of this made any sense to me whatsoever, and the Ouija board's claims had completely confounded me. I did not share my misgivings or fears with my closest friends, for there are some thoughts that are not wise to share. There was one thing I did know, and that was I was going to throw that Ouija board away first thing in the morning. Whoever and whatsoever had entered my bedroom on this inauspicious evening, it was almost certainly not my father. My father would never have displayed such aggression. This idiosyncratic entity that had broken my clock had felt insidiously evil and malevolently dark, and had filled me and my friends with a crippling, terrorizing fear. So I lay awake for most of the night, pondering over everything that had transpired. My brow was sweating profusely, my heart thundering violently in my chest almost all of the night, while my eyes restlessly tried to fight off the urgent need to sleep. Logan's account. As I turned in for the night, I was bewildered to see that the two cats that would normally sleep in my bedroom were nowhere to be seen. I had fed them, and they had abandoned the house with an eagerness I had never observed before. The two cats, Cinnamon and Spice, tended to stay indoors most of the time. Most of the time were lackadaisical and affectionate, preferring a tummy rub and a tickle under the chin, rather than going exploring in the great outdoors. They were cats that appreciated fine living, and all their creature comforts, but tonight their behaviour was distinctly unorthodox. I noticed that Bagel, the dog, was whimpering and scratching at the kitchen door, desperate to make his escape. He couldn't wait to leave the confines of the house. The weather was good, so I allowed him to stay out on the wraparound porch in his basket, which he often liked to do according to Mrs. Stoneheart. I watched him tearing over to the oak tree and lying on the ground there, which was something he always did. I couldn't comprehend why Bagel loved lying under that oak tree so much, but I just thought it was some rather bizarre, quirky, outlandish habit. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, and a horrible chill ran down my spine. I turned around to look behind myself. I got the most horrible, uneasy feeling that someone was watching me, but when I turned around, nothing was actually there. It was later during the night that I suddenly awoke with an abrupt start. I could hear heavy combat boots pounding up and down the staircase. Clomp, clomp, clomp. I felt unduly alarmed, wondering if someone had broken into the house, as I knew those boots were not made from the young teenagers sleeping under this roof, as all three of those girls had a very quiet footfall. The door of my bedroom just creaked wide open, but nobody was there. But I was certain someone was, but I couldn't see them. I could feel a bodeful, threatening presence, a dark, inauspicious, gloomy energy, and a feeling that someone quite menacing was watching me, although I couldn't see anything at all, nothing at all. Was I going completely mad, I wondered? But the doubts of my sanity were alleviated when the clanking, heavy boots plundered the oakwood floor of my bedroom, with the same repetitive, unnerving, clomping sound. Someone was walking towards the edge of my bed, but there was still nobody standing there. I was so astonished. "Simone, is that you?" I called out, feeling certain that the 14-year-old girl and her two friends were playing a macabre trick on me to scare the bejesus out of me. And boy, it was working. I was half expecting them to be giggling behind the door. But how could they pull a stunt off like this? The hair at the back of my neck was standing up on edge, and my chest tightened so hard, while a loud thumping from my heart seemed to thunder through my chest. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, until it felt like a freezer unit, as an icy gust of cold air swirled around and around and around like a swarm of bees, making a strange, rather peculiar buzzing sound. There were no windows open. The weather was pleasantly warm. So why was I shivering? Why was I so numbingly cold? The next thing I knew was something had climbed onto my bed. I could feel my mattress heaving under a sizable, ponderous and heavy weight. Something had bounced on top of the bed. The springs retaliated with a squeaking sound, but there was nothing Nobody there. I could see my duvet cover being trampled as the fabric sank into deep depressions. Then the next thing I knew, something was on top of me, pinning me down, while these freezing ice-cold hands grabbed hold of my neck and began to squeeze and squeeze me tightly. I cannot breathe. Oh my God, I can't breathe. Something is trying to kill me. I try desperately to fight back as hard as I can, punching at nothing with my fists. I try in vain to wrestle with something, but I can't get to anything because nothing is there, which is so discombobulating. That's when I observe this malignant, hostile face hovering above me that had pernicious gargoyle influences to it. A large, deathly pale white face with pointed ears like that of an elf. Blazing red eyes, the colour of traffic lights, canine teeth, and the most vindictive smile. This entity looked human, but then again it didn't. It was squeezing me violently hard. I was struggling to breathe, fighting this thing off with all my might. And then it said to me in a raspy, murderous voice,
I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you.
It continued to squeeze my neck, while I desperately tried to fight back. And then it suddenly just left my room like that. I saw this thick black mass float away, disappearing with a swooshing sound right through the wall of my bedroom. I sat up, gasping for breath, the perspiration pouring down my forehead, my heart pounding violently in my chest. It certainly took a long while to resume its normal pace. Suffice to say, I was in such a heightened nervous state that I slept the rest of the night with my lights on, as the prospect of this evil entity returning to finish off what he had started was all-consuming. There was definitely a heaviness in the house that I'd never observed before. Even when I rose up from my bed the following morning, there were no cats lying comfortably on the covers, and the sunlight bouncing through the crack in the curtains was rather subdued. I knew that the cats and dog had all perceived something was off in the house. That was why the cats had abandoned my bedroom. It all made sense now. But this demonic presence did not. Where on earth had it come from? The next morning, once Simone's friends had left the house, I knocked on her bedroom door.
Simone? Simone? Simone, can I come in?
What is it? Came the cantankerous voice from the other side of the door, that I was growing used to by now.
It's me. Please may I come in for a moment, have a word with you, that's all.
Well, you're going to anyway, so I don't know why you even bother to ask. Simone is lying on her bed, reading a novel, with the Rolling Stones blasting in the background. I notice she looks a little on edge today. There's a frightened look in her eyes that I've never discerned before. The girl looks distinctly troubled, almost as if something is weighing heavily on her mind. It's similar look that I've seen in my mother when she's aggrieved about something.
I need to ask you something, Simone. It's important, and I want you to be very straight with me. Is your house by any chance haunted? Have you had any paranormal experiences in here at any stage that you can remember?
At this, Simone looks at me with a bemused expression. Her voice sounds almost feeble, as her bolshy demeanour seems to drop away, like the seed pods from a tree. No, of course not. Why would you say such a strange thing?
Because last night I was attacked by a demonical entity. This thing, it wasn't human. I don't know what it was. I know you're not going to believe me, and...
I was expecting Simone to raise her eyebrows objectionably, even ridicule me for such a preposterous suggestion. But her eyes grow round with alarm. She clasps her hands over her mouth. I believe you, she says obsequiously. Me and my friends, we did something really stupid last night. I'm really scared, Logan. I've been a complete idiot. I can't believe I was so stupid.
What did you do? Simone, I asked. Did you bring this monster into this house? You're not involved in witchcraft, are you?
I asked, looking at Simone aghast. Nothing like that. Simone gets off her bed. She pulls out a long black box that contains a Ouija board and a blanchette. We played with this last night. Honestly, Logan, it was only a bit of fun. We just asked a few questions. The thing was answering us. It claimed to be my father. It was saying my mother had murdered him and buried him under the oak tree out there.
You know the spot where Bagel lies down a lot? In the end, we put the board away. We couldn't continue playing. We were so scared. You see, my bedside clock actually slid across the nightstand all on its own and went crashing off, landing all over the ground. There was glass shards everywhere. She walks over to her wastepaper basket and shows me the evidence of her damaged clock. I stare at the broken pieces blankly. It also began moving the planchette on its own, spelling out my father's name, Angus, claiming he was murdered by my mother, which is such a big lie. My mother would never ever do that. But then you know, demonical entities, they always lie about everything. So you saw the clock just slide off the nightstand, I say. That's right. It lifted off on its own, remaining in the air, almost as if someone was holding it. Then it crashed to the ground. We didn't scream. Actually, I'm quite surprised we didn't. But I think maybe our fear was hijacked by this sense of, stunned stupor, I suppose. It was like we could feel a heaviness in the room. It was thick and oppressive, like the air became dense with a tangible darkness that you could actually sense. It was intimidating. So we immediately started to pray. The energy lifted. The thing went away. We were so scared, Logan. We slept all night with the light on. If this thing attacked you, it means it's still in the house. There's no telling what it's capable of doing. What are we going to do? I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to call Father Waitman. We need him to come here tonight to pray over this house. You need to make sure you throw this thing out, this Ouija board. Go and put it in the bin. Do you understand? Simone nodded and dutifully dashed downstairs to let herself out into the backyard, where I could hear her dispatching the Ouija board in the bin. Well, at least that nasty thing was out of the house. That was a good start. Father Waitman arrived at our house in the late afternoon. He was a very good man who was of Irish ancestry and wore his heritage proudly. So what's this all about, young Logan? Your phone call intrigued me this morning, asked Father Waitman, as he climbs out of his vehicle and closes the door behind him. You say you were attacked last night by a demonical entity that was conjured up when Simone was playing with a Ouija board with her friends. The demon pretended to be Simone's father, and later on it attacked you. Am I right? That's right, Father. That pretty much sums what happened to me last night. This thing, Father, it was wickedly evil. It physically attacked me. I've never been so scared in all my life. I really thought it was going to kill me. I pulled my collar back so the priest could examine the black bruises around my neck that looked like 5 finger marks. Nasty, says the father. Very, very nasty. He examines my neck. Something certainly attacked you. The question is, what? Lead me into the house. I want to see if I can pick up the energy, will you? Me and Simone wait with bated breath in the kitchen as we hear the father walking through the rooms in the house. He then reappears into the kitchen. There's something demonical in this house for sure. The energy is dark, heavy, decidedly wicked. I'm in no doubt that when you were playing with that Ouija board, Simone, you invited a demon into this house, I'm afraid. By playing with the Ouija board, you gave him permission to enter our reality. We need to send him right back from whence he came. It's not unusual for a demon to pretend to be someone they're not. They're the masters of duplicity. So I'm not surprised the demon emulated your father. So do demons lie about everything, Father Waitman? Asked Simone. Do they ever tell the truth? Only if it suits their agenda, says Father Waitman. But Father Waitman, can we really get rid of this thing? What if we can't? Of course we can get rid of it, says the father. With God all things are possible. I'm going to get you, Logan, to burn the incense as we walk throughout the house. I'll be sprinkling holy water in every room, and we will be praying very hard. Now, I need you to understand that this is a team effort. You cannot afford to be afraid under any circumstances. Do you understand that? No matter how intimidated you may become. I need you to hang on to your faith like your life depends on it. Imagine if you're in an ocean, and the only thing that is keeping you afloat is a piece of driftwood. You'd cling to it for dear life, wouldn't you? Until you were rescued, would you not? We nod. There you go, says the pastor. Likewise, I need you to cling to your faith like that piece of driftwood, no matter what. Don't you dare entertain fear. This thing is not as powerful as God. Do you understand? Our rescuer is God. He will rescue us if we remain in our faith. So I need you to trust that all will go well. Do you understand?
We nod dutifully, ever grateful that the pastor has come to our rescue, for we can sense that the clawing energy in the house is easily tarnished by an ominous heaviness that was never here before. We move through every room in the entire house. The father is generously sprinkling holy water everywhere, while I'm burning frankincense from a metal censer with chains known as a thurible, which I'm swinging around as the smoke permeates the entire house with a pleasing woody fragrance.
Saint Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, of Prince of heavenly hosts, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all his spirits that wander through the world for the ruination of souls.
For a while, I hasten to say, I almost feel foolish going around the house praying these prayers, as everything around us seems so benign, almost indifferent to what we're doing. But things radically change when we end up in my bedroom, which we'd chosen to do last, as it was the only room in which I was attacked. I remember when Mrs. Stoneheart had shown me into this bedroom, with its emerald green bed covers and pale mint green walls that mirrored the verdant views of the countryside. I had been beguiled by the attractiveness of the room. But now its attractiveness has been swallowed whole by an all-consuming dark energy. It was clear to all of us we had contained this demon. He was here in the room with us. We closed the door behind us rather reluctantly, while the father opened the bedroom window. We began to pray, and then quite suddenly something pushed me down so hard. I could feel hands snaking around my neck, and something hissing in my ear. I don't know how I held it together, but I did. The priest's story of clinging to the driftwood for dear life helped me to remain grounded. Something began to growl, but we continued to pray. And then we saw this thick blanket of black mass just leave through the window, rising up into the air, and vanish before our very eyes.
It's finally gone, said the pastor. We got rid of it. It could have been a lot worse. I've done lot worse than this, I assure you. But luckily you only summoned it recently. The longer you leave it, the stronger these entities become. So I'm glad you called me when you did. Thank you, Pastor Waitman. Thank you very, very much for helping us out today. I'm most grateful to you.
So am I, Pastor Waitman. Thank you so much. We both hugged the priest gratefully. Suffice to say, my relationship with Simone changed after this experience, as we had been brought together in tumultuous circumstances which had made a girl who saw me as an enemy her friend. Everything in the house had shifted dramatically. The energy was light and airy, and the cats were once again lying happily stretched out on my bed, as if nothing had changed, and Bagel, whom had spent most of his time running around the backyard and lying in his usual spot under the oak tree, was now bounding around the house, wagging his tail and emitting excited yaps. I could tell that the animals perceived that something had indeed lifted in the house. The energy was remarkably different. It must have been an hour or so before I returned to bed that night that I noticed the black box that contained the Ouija board lying on top of the refrigerator, and I felt incredibly angry. After everything that had transpired, after everything we'd been through in the house, along with the cleansing of the demonical spirit, why had Simone failed to throw out the Ouija board? It was nonsensical. She had promised me that she had binned it. I thought I'd actually heard her throwing it away. Had she suddenly changed her mind? I thought better than going off to her bedroom and giving her the riot act. That wouldn't be a good idea. We were getting on so well now. I didn't want to put a spanner in the works. So I decided to get rid of the Ouija board myself. So I surreptitiously binned it and thought no further of the matter. It is later that night that I rise up out of my bed, having heard a loud clamouring sound coming from the outside bins. The first thought that comes into my mind is that Simone discovered that I had thrown out the Ouija board and was hell-bent on retrieving it. I knew the girl was resolutely stubborn at the best of times, and seemed to have some kind of attachment to the board, almost as if the demonical entity himself was trying to use her mind to gain access to her home again.
Maybe she was the weak link for the demonical entity to cunningly manipulate. I chastised myself for not having burnt the Ouija board. Then I would not have had to listen to the ramblings of a 14-year-old girl persuading me that she needed to keep the board, but that she would never use it, like I'd ever believe that, for a single moment. One weak moment and she'd be using it all over again, despite the havoc and chaos it had actually caused. It's like people who take drugs and have come close to losing their lives playing this dangerous game with life and death. And despite all the precarious risks, what do? They shoot up all over again. With an indignant frustration swirling through my mind, I hurriedly raced down the sweeping staircase, grabbing my torch, and I hurried towards the bins in the outside yard. I'm expecting to see Simone standing there, desperately trying to retrieve the Ouija board I'd binned, but it is not her that I'm seeing. I see this huge, ambiguous figure hovering over the bin and sifting through the rubbish, throwing the unwanted debris paper bags and boxes all over the ground. It then pulls out the black box containing the Ouija board. What the hell, I think? What on earth is this thing? And what does it want with the Ouija board? The light of my torch hovers over this creature, and that is when I see him clearly. The creature is 9 foot tall, covered in hair as dark as coal, built like a powerful army tank, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head that sweeps down into a pair of gargantuan-sized shoulders. It would have been easy to think, based on the dense shape of this massive creature, that this was another demonical being like the one I'd encountered the previous night, that had tried so desperately to strangle me. When the creature looks up at me through its soulful, deep-set yellow eyes, I know this is no demon, for the creature has the eyes of an angel, and in that moment, that was what I actually believed he was. He may not have looked like the angels described in the biblical texts, but this creature seemed angelic in every single regard. You would have believed the same if you'd seen those kind, loving eyes that are almost impossible to describe, but they were like liquid love. I watched as the creature pulls open the black box, and with his powerful hands he tears up the Ouija board, as if it's nothing. The board was stiff and unyielding, but this creature tears it up into tiny pieces, as if it's a piece of paper. He does the same to the box and the blanchette. Once it's done, the creature picks up all the mess, replaces it back into the bin neatly, and then looks up directly at me. "Don't play with what you don't understand," I hear the voice speaking into my head, and I watch in awe as the creature disappears into the woodgrove, and then is gone from my sight. When he glides away, he looks like he's floating on air. In that moment I knew that the year of the firehorse I would never be able to forget, for I believed I had met an angel. It was only about 20 years later I was to discover that this idiosyncratic angel that I had encountered was in fact a Bigfoot. I believe they are able to pick up energy fields, and that this Bigfoot knew that the Ouija board contained a dark energy that needed to be destroyed. 30 years later, my mother-in-law calls me and my wife, Simone, into the bedroom. Yes, believe it or not, that obnoxious teenager, Simone Stoneheart, actually became my wife later on in life. If you had told me I'd have married that unruly, belligerent, rather capricious young lady, I would have almost certainly laughed in your face and said, "Never!" I'd have asked you what you were smoking, but miracles happen. Suffice to say I remained friends with Simone for many years after the horrifying paranormal event in her home that bonded us together. Let's just say the teenager had a radical metamorphosis into quite the little butterfly, and I fell hopelessly in love with her, and the rest is history. "What is it, Mother? Are you all right?" Simone asks, noticing her mother's earnest look. "I'm fine, sweetheart," says the stoic woman, staring at us through her pale blue eyes. Simone's mother was dying from lung cancer, although she'd never smoked a single day in her life. She didn't have long left to live, and was hanging on to life by a hair's breadth. By all accounts, the woman had good and bad days. This was one of her better ones. "I need to talk to the both of you. It's very important," she almost whispers. "Of course, Mum," says Simone, taking a chair and pulling it up to her mother's bed, holding her mother's hand. I pull up a chair as well. "I want you to do me a favour, sweetheart, after I'm gone." "Of course," says Simone. "Anything." "I want you to bury me with your father. Bury us both together. Could you do that for me? I'd like us to be together in that cemetery I like. Remember the one I pointed out to you a while ago?" Simone gives me a withering look. "Mum, I can't promise you that." You know I can't. Dad's been missing for so many years. Even if he's dead, I wouldn't know how to locate his remains. He is dead, sweetheart. I killed him. He's buried under the oak tree. Remember how devoted Bagel was to your father when he was alive? And after your father died, he'd lie under the oak tree looking all sorrowful. He was grieving your father's loss, lying over his grave to feel close to him. That's why his behaviour was so peculiar back then. Simone looks unhinged, as if someone has just thrown a bucket of ice-cold water over her head. Mum, you're talking nonsense. You wouldn't do that. I don't understand. Why would you kill Dad? You loved him so much. The two of you had an enviable relationship. It's because I loved him, dear. That's why I killed him. In the end, I had to do it. I couldn't see someone I love suffer like that. It was tortuous. In our society, we wouldn't let an animal suffer like this. We'd put it out of its misery. Your father had been begging me to kill him for ages. He was in unendurable pain, sweetheart. You know, your father fell off that horse, don't you remember? He damaged his back really badly. He was in excruciating pain, a pain that simply refused to go away. We did absolutely everything we could to eliminate the pain. We visited consultants, experts, doctors, natural health care practitioners, but they were so useless, unable to help us find solutions to this problem. Your father was put on the strongest, most potent painkillers and medications that worked for a short while, but the tenacious, unrelenting pain would always come back. Sometimes your father would weep. The pain was insufferable. Your father wanted to put a bullet in his head, but he just couldn't do it. He believed suicide would mean his soul would be left in limbo. But if he was killed, he would be able to rest in peace. I know your father put on a brave front, but you have no idea what that man went through. Some nights he just wept and wept, begging me over and over again to help him. One day I agreed to do it. I couldn't bear to see him suffer a moment longer. I remember he took a ton of painkillers and helped me to dig the grave under the oak tree for himself. I don't know how he did it, but he did. Do you remember that absolutely wonderful day we had together, when we went to the diner as a family? You had your favourite food. You had a double thick chocolate milkshake, burgers and chips, and later your dad bought you that beautiful silver bracelet with a diamond clasp. Don't you remember that? Simone nods. The tears spill down her cheeks. I remember, she says, choking back the tears. That was one of the best days of my life ever. That was his way of saying goodbye to you, sweetheart. Mrs. Stoneheart points to her cupboard. Would you be so kind as to bring down that shoebox, Logan, over there? No, not that one, the pink one. Open it up, Logan, will you? There's an envelope in there with a letter. It says, "To whom this may concern." Open it up, will you? Read it to us. It says, "To whom it may concern. I have asked my wife to smother me to death. She will be doing this by sitting on my head in the grave I will be lying in, so she doesn't have to move my body to the grave site, because I would be far too heavy for her. It should be easy for her to cover my remains up with the loose soil. She is in no way responsible for my passing. You cannot and will not convict her for something I have asked her to do for me. This is a mercy killing that I begged her to do for me for weeks on end. I literally begged her for help until she relented. There were no doctors, consultants, or alternative help practitioners that could do anything to ease my suffering. No one could help me. My wife did this with a huge reluctance, but out of the goodness of her kind heart. I would have happily spared her this responsibility, but I believe committing suicide would subject my soul to limbo, so that is why I asked her to do this for me. I am hoping you will never be reading this letter, that no one will know my true story, that I will be a missing person that no one can trace. But should you be holding my wife behind bars for something she did not do willingly, then shame on you, and I say it again, shame on you. If you would do that, may God have mercy on your soul, because believe me, you're going to need it. No self-respecting, decent human being on this earth would find my wife even remotely guilty of killing me, out of a courageous act of compassion. I am very sorry it had to be this way. Simone snatches the letter from me, her tears welling up on the page. Why didn't you tell me, Mum? Why didn't you tell me all this? I'm sorry, darling. I couldn't. Did Dad suffer, Mum? I mean, how did you actually do it?
like your father said. First of all, we both cried. We hugged each other. Your father told me he loved me, and he was desperately sorry that he had to do this. Then he lay back in the hollow in the ground, and I put a pillow over his face, and I sat on it for a while, with all my body weight, blocking his airflow. It wasn't actually too hard, funny enough. Did he struggle, Mum? Try and fight you off? No, he didn't. He moved around uncomfortably, but no, he didn't. It was over very quickly. He looked so peaceful. I lay in that grave with him for over an hour, with Bagel at my feet. Poor Bagel. He was so distressed. He was trying to wake your father up with his paws, but he just couldn't. I then just covered your father's remains, and the pillow, with the loose soil, and then I brushed all the dead leaves over his resting place, and that was it. So you reported Dad missing. I know you did that. Of course I did. A policeman came over, but I was so genuinely distraught that he knew how upset I was. They weren't suspicious of me at all. I gave them the note your father had written as a cover. It said,
"Sorry, I can't take it any more. Our fighting has driven me to the edge. I can't bear living with you any more. I'm leaving. Don't try to find me." When the police read my letter, they said to me, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your husband left on his own accord. He doesn't want to be found." It was as easy as that. "You and Dad really thought this out," says Simon. "Poor Dad. I remember that day after he bought me the diamond bracelet. He said to me, 'Simone, this is to remind you that I always love you, no matter what, and don't ever forget that.' He did love you, sweetheart, very much indeed. He said if you were to ever find out the truth about his passing, he wanted you to know that he was very sorry, but he loved you very much, and to please forgive him." Simone is blubbering now, the tears consuming her face as they trickle down in long trailing streams. "Of course I forgive you, Dad, wherever you are. I'm just so sorry that nothing could have been done for you, and this all had to be clandestinely covered up. It's not right, Mum, that you and Dad had to live with this secret." I put my arms around the dying woman. "You know what, Mrs. Stoneheart? I am so impressed with you. So incredibly impressed, I don't know what to say. I always knew you were a stoic character, hiding a grievously deep hurt from the very moment I met you. I really commend you for your incredible courage. What you did was so brave. I don't know if I could have done it myself."
"Oh, you could, Logan. If you saw my daughter suffering in that kind of pain, you would have moved the world to eliminate it for her. It's called love. There's nothing complicated about it at all. It is what it is." "I know it's a lot to ask, Logan, but could you dig up my husband's remains and hide them under my body in the coffin so we can be buried together in the same casket?"
Of course I'll do it."
And that's exactly what we did. When I dug up the remains of Simone's father, there was not much left of him. I was able to put his remains in a plastic bag. It was easy to hide his bones under the upholstering in my wife's mother's coffin. When we requested a moment of privacy in the church to have some quiet time with my mother-in-law, we were able to discreetly tear away some of the upholstering, and the bones were discreetly tucked behind my mother-in-law. But I'm glad to say no one opened the coffin, and so Simone's mother got her wishes, and her secret stayed buried with her. Looking back, we realised the demon that masqueraded as Angus, Simone's father, had actually told us some truths when he told us that he had been killed and was lying underneath the oak tree. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, the policeman is looking at me with a perplexed expression on his face. He wrinkles up his brow, studying me judiciously through his shrewd, keen brown eyes that really rather remind me of a bird of prey. I sense he's studying me rather curiously. I can see he's good at his job, looking at my face for any signs of guileful duplicity, to see if I'm sneakily hiding anything. But my pale white face probably looks as blank as a sheet, giving nothing away. There are grievous dark circles under my eyes, and my lacklustre blonde hair hangs limply around my face in bedraggled disarray, looking decidedly grimy. It's crying out for a wash. So I know I look a sight for sore eyes, but I really don't care if I look as if I've been dragged through a hedge backwards. This is the repercussions of being a new mother, who is not really dealing with the challenges of my role terribly well. The birth of my daughter Wren has pretty much turned our lives upside down. Right now my primary focus needs to be on Graham. Where the hell is he? I'm so troubled and perturbed by my husband's inscrutable absence, and I have this uneasy sense that something quite dreadful has happened to him. I bite my lip and avoid the officer's intense gaze, as I do not want him to see the fear in my eyes.
But surely, ma'am, if your husband was going camping for the weekend, you would know where he was going.
I sigh with frustration. My life is chaotic at the moment, officer. I have a newly born baby to think about. She consumes all my attention 24/7. So forgive me for being so distracted. My husband just mentioned he was going on a camping trip in the heat of the moment, you could say, but he never returned home. It's been a week, officer. I haven't seen sight or sound of him. That's actually why I contacted you. This unorthodox behaviour is so unlike him. I'm exceedingly worried about him, officer. You see, officer, it's not like him at all not to return home, I say with a withering tear trailing down my cheek, which I quickly brush away, as I certainly don't want the officer seeing me wrought up with emotion like this. So I straighten my back up, trying to compose myself by keeping up my stoic self-possession and collected self-control that is rarely crumbling at the seams. It's not an easy charade to execute. The officer keeps studying me through his judicious eyes that miss nothing. He pretended not to notice my tears, which I'm exceedingly glad about. If he had offered me any sympathy at all, I might have bawled my eyes out in front of him, and really embarrassed myself as a result. I always try to keep a stiff upper lip. My mother told me it was most unbecoming and salacious to let people ever see your emotions or sentiment. I assure you, sweetheart, it makes people very uncomfortable when someone gets lamentably emotional. People have their own issues to deal with. They don't need to be drawn into yours. You always need to hold it together. Don't let your feelings show if you know what's good for you. I'd always abided by my mother's principles in this regard, but right now I'm barely holding it together.
But you didn't ask him where he was going,
says the officer, clearly finding this revelation of mine quite incredulous. He might have told me, officer, but I wasn't really listening or paying attention. As I was saying, it was a last-minute decision of his. He gathered his stuff and off he went very early on Saturday morning, at about 2:30, I think it was. I knew exactly what the officer was thinking. I was possibly the most dithery, tentative and disengaged person he'd ever met, so disconnected to the comings and goings of my husband that for all I knew he could have taken a rocket to Mars, and I'd be none the wiser. My face blushes bright red, as I realise that perhaps I'm not quite the dutiful wife I should have been. I'm coming across as very dispassionate and disconnected, which might be a red flag to him, feeding into the idea that I might have something to do with my husband's disappearance, when nothing could be further from the truth. My mind squeamishly flashes back to the argument we had before he left. I'd been far too angry with him to even contemplate daring to ask him where he was going, even though I knew he was going camping as he'd grabbed his backpack and camping gear. By all accounts, my head may have been in the clouds, but that's what a lack of sleep can actually do to you.
So you say he left his cell phone at home. Does he make a habit of forgetting his cell phone? It's very unusual for someone to forget their cell phone. It happens, but most people these days seem to be joined to their cell phones by the hip. It's rare for people not to be in possession of their cell phone.
I scowl at the officer. He's beginning to irritate me.
Officer, do you have any children? I ask him churlishly. No, I don't.
Well then, don't presume to know what it's like. It's easy to forget your head, let alone a cell phone, when you've got 1,000 things on your mind. For your information, I've personally forgotten my cell phone at home dozens of times. I'm certainly not joined at the hip to mine. I'm sorry, but in my opinion that would be pathetic if I allowed myself to be controlled by modern technology, I say, bristling. If you must know, I doubt Graham cared that he forgot his cell phone behind. It wasn't a big deal for him, as he wanted to get away from it all, and that means also escaping the perils of your cell phone, believe it or not. I point towards the nursery, where my 5-month-old baby is lying fast asleep. You have no idea, officer, do you, what it's like for Graham and me, I say obsequiously. My baby chooses to scream and scream at night. We barely ever have a wink of sleep. My husband couldn't take it any longer. He went away for a couple of days, that's all. I think it was good he left, if you must know, because we're getting on each other's nerves. At this revelation, the officer physically stiffens,
raising his back. His pencil in his hand is now tapping awkwardly. I notice he's scribbling some notes. So you were fighting, Mrs. Ferris, with your husband Graham before he vanished. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know what you're implying. My husband did not vanish, officer. I don't care for the oblique words you're actually using. It's like you're clandestinely insinuating that I stabbed my husband to death and have buried him under the patio after a heated altercation. I take offence to that, officer. I really do. Sorry to disappoint you and to dash your hopes. But our lives are not another dramatic episode in a rather riveting, gripping Agatha Christie novel. We're ordinary people, living ordinary lives, who love each other. Yes, I was exhausted, officer. Yes, we were arguing. And yes, he did say he needed to go off for a couple of days. And yes, I didn't ask him where the hell he was going. I can assure you, officer, ask any new parents and they'll tell you about the frayed nerves and tension when you bring a new one home. It's a whole new adjustment when you have another soul depending on you. Things get heated at times, especially when you both want the best for your little baby, and you have different opinions on how things should be done, and how you should raise your child. My husband and I have different conflicting opinions in this regard, but a screaming child can really throw a spanner in the works.
You say he's been gone for a week. Now, you filed your missing persons report 2 days after he disappeared. I know that. But given he is a grown man, Mrs. Ferris, I put it to you, could your husband not have chosen to take an extended break? If you say he was rather tired, he might have decided to do just that. I mean, at this stage of the game, is there any need to get inordinately alarmed like this?
Yes, there is, officer. My husband is prudently reliable, officer. I can assure you of that. He might go off for a weekend without being in contact with me, but no longer than that, without getting in touch first to explain what was going on. Suffice to say, his office was expecting him back on Tuesday morning. He'd arranged some high-profile meetings with overseas clients. I promise you he would not have missed those appointments for the world. Something has happened to him, officer, and I'm exceedingly worried about him.
So worried that you never asked where he was going, Miss Ferris. Forget me for reiterating this point, but I do find it peculiarly odd.
Look, officer, I've got a lot on my plate at the moment. Whether you find it odd or not, officer, is of no concern of mine. I don't care a jot about that. You need to be doing your job, don't you? You need to help me find my husband. I don't know why you're wasting your time asking me these stupid questions. All this nonsensical stuff, it's absolutely ridiculous. You need to be out there looking for my husband. He could be hurt. He could be lying in a ditch somewhere. And you're just sitting here, doing nothing.
Look, Mrs. Ferris, I'm doing my job as best as I can. There is no point in searching for your husband until we've established some facts. Otherwise, we'll be chasing after fresh air, and that won't get us anywhere. I'm afraid questions need to be asked. Do you have your husband's truck details? That might be a start to try and locate the whereabouts of his vehicle, and put out an alert to keep an eye out for it.
Well, I don't know what they are, officer, of course, but I guess I could find the paperwork for you. It's probably in the desk in the office. But surprise, surprise, I say sarcastically, I don't know his registration number. Now, I know you're going to be horrified about that, officer.
Well, it would be very helpful if you could find the details. Where do you think he'd have gone camping at a guess? You must have some rough idea. I imagine you've gone camping with him before. Have you got an inkling where he might have gone?
Well, he does often go on the Appalachian Trail in Fannin County from Springer Mountain. I've been on those trips with him lots of times, so I'd say that would be the obvious place to look. It's only an hour away from where we live, and he usually goes on that trail. But I did drive over there. I didn't see his truck in the parking bay there. It's a silver Ford Escape. I would have noticed it at once if it had been there. I know exactly where he'd park. We've done the trail, as I say, lots of times, which leads me to conclude that he may have gone somewhere else, but I can't think where.
Well, we'll get people to search that part of the trail for you. You say he's familiar with it. In my experience, people tend to take routes they're very well acquainted with. Did he go with anyone on this trip?
I think I'd have told you if he had, officer, I say gingerly.
Another thing, Mrs. Ferris. What was your husband's state of mind?
What's that supposed to mean?
The officer looks uncomfortable as he clears his throat. This time his eyes deliberately drop to the carpet in my living room, avoiding my gaze. I mean, Miss Ferris, did your husband have any issues with depression or any kind of mental problems you can think about? How was his behaviour when he left the house on Saturday morning? You say he left very early. I can't believe this, officer. What on earth are you trying to suggest? That my husband went off to commit suicide? To kill himself? Absolutely not. He'd never ever do that. He's got far too much to live for. Besides, he adores our baby. He'd never willingly abandon us like that. Never, never. Besides, my husband doesn't get depressed. Yes, he does have moments when life can be overwhelming for him. But don't we all? We have our on and off days. But it doesn't mean we want to put a bullet through our heads, does it? I'm sorry, Mrs. Ferris. I had to ask that question. But what about his mood when he left your home after your fight? Might I be so impertinent to ask what the fight was actually about? Do you really need to know something so trivial, so personal? I ask, feeling my heckles rise in indignation. Aren't some things meant to be private, officer? Or do I have to bare my whole soul to you? Not when I'm trying to find your husband, Mrs. Ferris. I need to build up a clear picture in my head of everything that happened before he left your home. It might seem insignificant to you, I know, but in my line of work, sometimes it's the ambiguously obscure details that can give us a profound revelatory answer and help us to find the whereabouts of a missing person. If I'm trying to remember, officer, exactly what we were fighting about, it was so trivial, so insignificant. Let me think for a moment, I say, pausing to reflect. Oh, it was about how many times I was feeding my baby. My husband insisted that every time our baby cried, she didn't always need a feed, and that I should sometimes ignore her when she cries, because then she'll stop. But I couldn't ignore her, officer. I just couldn't. I have to see she's all right. It was just a silly argument, that's all. Nothing serious. So how was he then when he left? His mood, I mean. He just said that he'd had enough of our bickering and needed a break and he was going away for the weekend. What did you say? I said, typical. When things get tough, you always run away. I see, said the officer. So how did he leave? Did he slam the door and drive away in haste? I flush pink. Something like that, officer. Yes, he was angry with me. He wasn't particularly happy. Did you see how well equipped he was for his trip? What kind of camping gear he took with him? No, I didn't, but I can imagine, officer. My husband always kept a backpack fully prepared for an adventure, so he'd have everything prepared. I can assure you of that. He's a very organised man. He always has his backpack filled with dehydrated food and bottles of drink and matches, torches, batteries, compasses, and everything you could possibly need for a camping trip. So, Mrs. Ferris, does your husband go camping solo often? He's done it all his life, officer. This is not something new for him. He loves the great outdoors. He loves the natural world and wild animals. He says it gives him perspective and peace of mind. When I met my husband, we camped together frequently on the Appalachian Trail. But since we've had the baby, we've been inactive in that regard. Thank you for your help, Mrs. Ferris. You've been most informative. I'll be in touch very soon, says the officer, getting up to leave. Oh, by the way, I spoke to Mrs. Ferris, your husband's mother. You mean Prunella? You spoke to Prunella? That's right. I think I should warn you she's in a bit of a state. You contacted her? You contacted her? That's right. Yes, I did. She needed to answer some questions for me. I groaned. Once the officer left, within 20 minutes, as I was expecting, my mother-in-law's car rolls down our driveway, and I know that things are going to get a hell of a lot more uncomfortable for me, as she bombards me with all kinds of awkward questions and willfully accuses me of her son's disappearance. I can see the woman slamming the door of her silver Mazda behind her, and trotting up to the front door, wheeling a Gucci suitcase behind her, with some clothes sticking out through the sides of the case. My guess is she threw her entire wardrobe in there, and jammed it shut. Well, are you going to let me in or not? Says my mother-in-law. She stands there in the doorway, looking as dishevelled as I feel. I've never seen her look like this before. I notice she's wearing her pink cashmere sweater inside out, and her hair is a heaped mess over her face, as the usual glamorous chignon looks like it's gallantly escaped its austere hold. "Well, don't just stand there, will you, looking so gormless? Are you going to let me in or not?" "Sorry, Prunella," I say, beckoning her inside. "I'm all over the place." Prunella gives me a scathing look as she drags her suitcase into the house, dumping it next to the hall table, and following me into the kitchen. People visiting me at my home tend to gravitate towards my kitchen, as our coffee machine surreptitiously calls to them, and there's some kind of a magnetic pull going on there. "Why did you not tell me that Graham was missing, dear?" she says, looking at me accusingly through her earnest blue eyes. "When the police informed me that he's been missing for a week, I nearly did my nut. Graham's father wanted to come here too, but I told him I'll handle things while he mans the fort back at home. I'm going to be moving in with you for a while. You're going to be needing my help with the baby. You can't manage on your own without Graham being around to help you." "I'm sorry, Prunella. I didn't want to worry you. That's why I didn't tell you." "You didn't want to worry me? Are you joking or something? Listen to yourself, dear. I'm Graham's mother. If something's happened to my son, I should be the first to be informed about this," she says, taking a seat at my kitchen counter, while I prepare the coffee machine to perform its frothy magic. She takes my mug of coffee from me with a snatch, and to my amazement she fills the mug with 7 teaspoons of sugar. Does anybody have that much sugar with their coffee, I wonder? Don't give me that judgmental look. I need this sugar. I'm feeling like a deflated alpine flower. I'm worried sick about poor Graham. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. If I knew what happened, Prunella, believe me, I would tell you. But I'm as clueless as you. That's why I called the police. But they've been a fat lot of help. I think they're going to be looking out for his truck, that's all. Checking the hiking trail. Prunella pauses for a brief moment, staring at the wilted flowers on the marble kitchen countertop that Graham had bought for me on the Friday before he disappeared. They're looking worse for wear. Some of the petals had fallen off onto the marble surface, but I didn't have the heart to throw them away. She looks at the flowers disapprovingly, sighs, gets up, and pulls them out of the vase, gathering them together in a heaped bunch, throwing them into the large pedal bin, after which she wipes down the countertop and throws away the confetti of remaining petals. Finally, she washes her hands at the fancy built-in sink and dries her hands with a hand towel. Not good energy. Has nobody told you it's not good to have dead flowers lying around the place? Mind you, they look exactly how I feel. Wilted, bedraggled and frayed. Now tell me, why did Graham go camping? I'm surprised he wasn't sticking around to help you with the baby. It's most unlike him to be this inconsiderate and selfish. He's always had a heart of gold on him, that boy. We kind of had an altercation. She raises one of her brows. I might have guessed you were behind this. You've always had a bit of a loose tongue on you, haven't you? You should watch yourself there. What do you mean, loose tongue, Prunella? I mean, you can sometimes say quite mean things. I've seen you from time to time. I've heard you say a few unpleasant words to my son before, when you've had a fight with him. Men don't like to be henpecked, you know. I don't henpeck Graham at all, I say defensively, irked by the unreasonable accusation that is tarnishing my character in a rather unfavourable way. If you must know, it was the other way round. He was the one goading me. Look, let's not squabble about this, shall we? I'm on your side, you know, sweetheart. I'm here to help with you and the baby, and to get to the bottom of this rather perturbing mystery. Regretfully, Graham has done this before. I had to tell the police about this, as they were asking me all kinds of awkward questions, and I wasn't about to lie to them. They need to know absolutely everything. What do you mean Graham has done this before? I asked, looking bewildered. Well, Graham has always had a bit of a habit of disappearing for a while, going camping when he was young, when things got on top of him, you know. When he got a wee bit overwhelmed, you could say. It would be his way to manage stress, I guess, by getting reconnected with nature. I remember when he was 18 years old, me and my husband were beside ourselves with worry, as Graham was gone for an entire week. He just vanished without a bye or leave. We sent out a search party to look for him, and then a week later he just returns home as if nothing had ever happened, claiming he'd left us a note to tell us exactly where he was. But we never received that note. We think he conveniently made that up as an afterthought when he realised the pandemonium he'd actually caused, and was feeling significantly bashful for his apathy. I could have killed him. I was as mad as a hatter. But when I saw him, I melted like butter, and was so thankful he was all right. I really thought he'd learnt from that lesson. I hope to God he hasn't done that again. This is the first time I've heard about this before, but I wish to God you hadn't told the police about this, Prunella. You can bet your cotton socks they won't take his disappearance seriously now, not after what you've told them, and that's a big, big problem for me. You see, Graham may have behaved irresponsibly when he was 18 years old, but I unequivocally believe he wouldn't do that now. He has a wife and baby to worry about, and he wouldn't willfully abandon us like this. I know he wouldn't. He's been gone for a week, and I'm at the end of my tether. I feel as if something quite dreadful has happened to him. This time I know it's different, can't you see? I say, sorrowful tears spilling down my cheeks, that try as I might, I simply cannot restrain. Look, sweetheart, I know this is all so overwhelming for you, she says, taking me into her arms lovingly. I'll kill him myself, see if I don't, if he comes through that door right now, wearing that indifferent expression on his face that he had all those years ago. You never know. Maybe things just got on top of him, dear. You were saying the baby was causing you both to quibble. Maybe he just needed a little break. I'm hoping to God that's what it is. Look at you. If you don't mind my saying, you do look dreadful. You need a long soak and a hot bath, and plenty of rest. I've never seen you look so fatigued before. You should have given me and my husband a call. What are grandparents for if we can't lend a hand? And inflict you with a screaming baby? Believe me, Prunella, you'll regret offering your help. My baby's a huge handful, and when she screams the house down. It's that bad. Oh, believe me, Graham was a big screamer himself back in his day. I know what you're going through. The main thing is I'm here to help in any way that I can. I was rather surprised at what a world of difference Prunella's appearance had made in my household, as the stress of not knowing exactly where Graham was had escalated my levels of exhaustion. I felt as if I was caught up in a cyclone or whirlwind, where I couldn't actually see the wood for the trees. Prunella insisted that I got some much-needed sleep, while she took care of the baby, cooked and cleaned. It really enabled me to gain some perspective. We knew it was a waiting game, and only a matter of time when answers to Graham's whereabouts would be forthcoming. Someone must have seen or heard something, surely. But as the days passed by, you were left feeling very deflated. Prunella insisted that no news was good news, but I don't believe that's true. Look at all those 411 cases when people vanished without a single trace. I kept wondering if that might be our story with Graham, and my last memories of him would have been the pathetic fight we'd engaged in, that seemed so ridiculously trivial now I came to think of it. I was cursing myself for allowing him to leave that morning. What was I thinking? At the very least we should have resolved our differences first. One night as I'm drying the dishes by the sink with Prunella washing them in the hot soapy water, wearing a long pair of rubber gloves, we'd been chatting away after a pleasant dinner, washed down with some Cabernet Sauvignon. It would seem Graham's disappearance had sealed an unlikely bond between us, and the aloof remote woman, who I'd always felt was somewhat unapproachable, had become a good friend to me. It was like the ice had melted between the two of us, as before this unfortunate incident we barely tolerated each other, and she didn't particularly like me as her son's wife. But now, out of a shared emotional strife over Graham's fortuitous disappearance, a genuine affection had been birthed between the two of us, something that years later I would thankfully appreciate, as we soon became not just best friends, but the very best of friends. I would have given you money that would never, ever have happened. Suddenly I observe a police car rolling down our long drive. It grinds to a sudden stop as the engine switches off. My heart begins to sink as I see the police officer climbing out of his car. I begin to fear the very worst. Is he going to tell us that my husband is dead? Oh, my God, please no. I'm sure he's going to tell me my husband is dead. My chest begins to tighten so considerably that for a brief moment I feel as if all my breath has been sucked out of me. Prunella and I look at each other with withered expressions, our faces ashen, defeated, but very resigned. I can see fear in her eyes, and my fear is conjoined, as our tortured souls become as one. My heavy heart thunders in my chest so violently. I can feel every pounding beat, as if it's going to explode in any second, while unwelcome prickles of perspiration roll down my back like sorrowful tears. The police officer walks over to the passenger side door of his truck and opens it. It seems like an idiosyncratic thing to do, unless there's a woman in the truck with him. Maybe a female officer, I think. Although on duty, would he extend such a chivalrous protocol to one of his female colleagues? I mean, it might be falsely construed in this day and age as condescending, which in my opinion is absolutely ridiculous. Men should be encouraged to be gentlemen, not condemned for it. It's dark outside, so I can't see clearly, as I scrunch up my eyes to focus better. A soft shower of moonlight gives me a distinct impression of whom I'm seeing, as a familiar figure comes into view, as the police officer helps the shadowy figure out of the truck, who hobbles to his feet. I gasp in astonishment, cupping my hands over my mouth. "Oh, my God! It's Graham! It's Graham!" I say to Prunella, my eyes gleaming brightly. "Oh, my God, he's back! He's alive! The police have brought him back!" My emotions seesaw from impending dread to ebullient joy. Me and Prunella spontaneously hug each other, as our delight cannot be suppressed. I hastily dash down the passage as fast as a March hare, with Prunella running behind me. I eagerly thrust open the front door to greet the advancing officer, who was just about to knock. I'm so excited that I'm about to run and leap into my husband's arms to welcome him back. But my eagerness is suddenly subdued, well, almost instantaneously. There's something distinctly off about my husband. He appears sombre, tentative, rather flustered. I notice he has a limp in his leg, and when he ambles to the door, he doesn't look like the Graham I know so well and love. Me and Prunella stare at him in abject horror, barely recognising him. My husband's eyes are black and blue, swollen, puffy and heavily bruised, almost as if someone's punched him directly in the eyes. I can see he's been badly scratched up and has taken a serious beating, as there are vertical ridges across his face, along his neck and collarbone, as if something with sharp talons has literally pierced his skin wide open. I notice there's dried blood on his scalp, and tufts of hair are missing on his head. I observe that Graham looks so dithery, discombobulated, glassy-eyed. He stares at me vacantly, with an ambiguously vague, rather blank look, and a nebulous expression on his face, almost as if he doesn't know who the hell I actually am. There's nothing more terrifying than seeing the person you know and love, seemingly unable to recognise you at all. "Officer," I say, looking at him befuddled, "what on earth has happened? What's wrong with my husband? Why does he seem so spaced out?" "All in due time, Mrs. Ferris. All in due time. Your husband is exceedingly exhausted. I think you need to put him to bed right now, and then we'll have a good talk. We've just come back from the hospital. Your husband's been given the all clear. He needs plenty of rest, I'm told."
"All clear? Are you kidding me, officer? Look at him! Look how spaced out he is! He looks like he's on another planet."
"He just needs time," says the officer. "Had a rather bad blow to the head, which has made him rather woolly-headed, but he is going to recover." I take my husband into the bedroom. He flops down into the bed like a rag doll. He looks so exhausted, so tired. He looks confused and disorientated, shutting his puffy eyes, giving me a rather bleary look. I kiss him on his cheek, roll back his hair to stroke his forehead affectionately. "What the hell happened to you, sweetheart? Oh, I'm so glad you're home. Thank God you're alive. I've been worried sick about you." My husband doesn't respond. He slips into a deep slumber. I can see he's so fatigued, so incredibly overwhelmed. When I return to my well-appointed, very cosy living room, the officer beckons for me to sit down on the upholstered chair, the one closest to the fireplace. "Well, this is what we know," he says, stroking his moustache reflectively. "A young couple on the Appalachian Trail found your husband wandering around aimlessly. He was groggy and dazed, very confused. The couple are both medics, so it was very fortunate. Husband's a doctor, the wife's a nurse. So they took him to hospital to run some cognitive tests and scans on him. By all accounts, the doctors believe that your husband, Graham, has been viciously beaten up by a wild animal. It looks suspiciously like a bear attack, given the bite marks and scratches on his torso and head. But your husband is currently suffering from concussion and a light amnesia. But he did remember his name for a very short while. Then he forgot it all over again. It's almost like his memory is a rusty battery, firing up occasionally, and then going static and losing its momentum, you could say. The doctors say for a man that's been gone for well over a week, he's extremely well nourished, well hydrated, and his wounds have healed up remarkably well. There are no infections, but it looks like there was a green stuff all over his wounds and gashes, as if he's been rubbing some antibacterial plant over himself. They also say his tongue was a bright green colour. Whatever the ointment was he used on himself, it has almost certainly prevented any infection. I imagine it must be down to his wilderness survival skills. Your husband clearly knows his plants. Needless to say, Miss Ferris, your husband is in a remarkably good way for someone so desperately muddled and thrown badly off balance. Suffice to say, his concussion is only temporary, but it'll take a while for him to fully heal. He's taken quite a beating. We cannot find your husband's camping site or any of his gear, so I think he may have wandered off the trail for a more private camping spot. There were campers who reported seeing him late on Saturday afternoon, the day that he left your home. They said he was exceedingly aloof, not particularly friendly, and he couldn't get away from the camping ground fast enough. In regards to your husband's truck, the mystery, I am glad to say, has finally been solved. Your husband left the door to his vehicle unlocked. 2 young kids took it for a joyride until they used up all his petrol. We found the truck abandoned, but one of the boys left his wallet inside the truck, so we were able to trace him. I think there must be something in the water enabling people to become exceedingly scatty and forgetful at the moment. Your husband failing to lock the car door, and one of the joyriders leaving behind his wallet.
Oh, on that, officer, I must defend my husband. Graham was probably so lethargic. He forgot to lock the truck door behind him. Let's just say our screaming baby made us both exceedingly burnt out and listless. You become incredibly dopey when you're drowsy. Believe me, I know. You can become careless, you drop things, break things, forget what you were supposed to buy at the grocery store. You sometimes can't even remember the day of the week, let alone the hour.
I understand, ma'am. You don't need to explain yourself any more to me. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but your husband's back home now, and all you need to do now is to devote your attention to helping him recover.
Thank you, officer. Thank you so much for your help.
It's a pleasure, Mrs. Ferris. I'm only doing my job. Just glad this has had a happy ending. But word of advice, Mrs. Ferris, if your husband goes away next time, it might be rather a good idea to find out his whereabouts.
I hardly think this is ever going to happen again, officer. I've learnt my lesson the hard way.
I hope it won't happen again, Miss Ferris. I will show myself out. Best of luck to the both of you.
I'm glad to say that slowly and surely my husband began to recover from his experience. But for 2 weeks he couldn't remember what had happened to him. And then one night he sat up, bolt upright in bed, and recounted the whole story to me of what had happened that inauspicious day, as his memories came flooding back, not in dribs and drabs as you might have expected, but the entire account, the mystery of his unorthodox experience on the Appalachian Trail, now fully revealed. But this was not the incredulous story that I was actually expecting to hear. Graham's account. Nobody tells you how tough it is to become first-time parents, and from the moment we brought our baby home from the hospital, as beautiful as she was, I regret to say that she had a pair of lungs on her that could make an ambulance siren sound like a little tinkle. Within no time at all sleep abandoned us, as every 2 hours during the night our baby would scream, scream, and scream. I would become so frustrated. I would arrive at work looking half dead, my face ashen, dark circles under my eyes. By all accounts, my work was suffering, as I yawned tirelessly during the day, and was perpetually forgetting things, and everyone was telling me I didn't look at all good. Let's just say that the wife was frustrating me immensely, as the moment our baby started to scream, she would groan, climb out of bed, and pander to our baby daughter all the time, which only encouraged our infant to scream all the more. I'd try to pull the sheet over my head and get some sleep, but all these woeful disturbances caused my sleep to become very broken.
"Don't go to her," I would tell my wife. "If you keep responding to her every time she screams, then she's going to make a habit of this behaviour. But if you ignore her, she might just shut up, and we'll get some decent shut-eye." "I can't do that, Graham," my wife had hissed. "She might need feeding or comforting." It didn't help when my wife's friend, Angeline, with a baby that's a similar age to our daughter, seemed to gloat when she commented on how tired we looked. "You poor things, you look so dreadfully shattered. I'm so lucky with little Amelia here. Oh, she gives me no trouble at all. She sleeps through the night like a charm. She's so incredibly well behaved. You poor things, I'm so glad I'm not like you." "It sounds to me, Angeline, like you are the most perfect mother," I say sarcastically. But Angeline has no idea I'm being sarcastic and giggles. "Well, I have been told I am a natural. Everybody thinks my baby is so well behaved. Well, you know, it's about being a sensitive mother, in tune with your baby's needs, stuff like that." "Well, you seem to have it down to a fine art, Angeline, don't you?" Me and my wife had visited our doctor to check that there was nothing wrong with our baby. We were informed that she was in excellent health. "She's always screaming," I explained to the doctor. "Surely there must be a problem here." "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Ferris. You do have my greatest sympathy. I wish there was something we could do about it. It's not easy for first-time parents like yourself. A baby screaming all the time is not good for one's health. Some babies are just much more vocal than others. Maybe she'll grow out of it." Suffice to say, the screaming got worse and worse. At 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, me and my wife had an altercation. I think my nerves were frayed. I was sick of the incessant, non-stop screaming. It just wouldn't stop. I was the one that now wanted to scream in frustration. I will confess there were days I secretly wished I didn't have to actually return home to my wife and child. I knew what lay in store for me. A night of hell, where I would languor in a sluggish somnolence. I'd have loved nothing better than to book into a hotel for a couple of nights, just to get some rejuvenating, refreshing sleep, to overcome my lassitude. "Please come back to bed," I shouted at my wife. "You're making everything so much worse." "Don't tell me what to do," she says, the tears springing down her cheeks. "I have to look after our baby. You're being so unreasonable, Graham. You don't know what it's like being a mother. She's always screaming. She just doesn't stop." "It's tough on me too, sweetheart. Now come back to bed." "No, I won't. I have to attend to the baby." "Well, I can't get sleep with you bustling around like this. You're keeping everybody wide awake." "Well, it's not my problem. I'm the one that has to look after the baby 24/7. All you do is come home and crash." "I've had enough. I'm going. I don't need to listen to you going on and on like this. I can't take it a moment longer. I've had enough. I've had enough of all this screaming. I've had enough of you getting up in the middle of the night, keeping me wide awake. I don't get a wink of sleep. Everybody in the office is commenting on how dreadful I look." I grabbed my camping gear at 2:30 in the morning and trudged towards the front door. "Go then," screams my wife. "See if I care." I must confess, once I was in the truck, driving to the parking lot at Springer Mountain, where the hiking trail begins, I felt a huge sense of relief about getting away from my little baby's raucous screams. I felt like a pressure cooker that had reached boiling point and was about to explode. I will confess I did feel guilty, leaving my wife alone with the baby to look after, but I simply wasn't functioning properly with so little sleep. The spontaneous last-minute camping trip seemed like a great idea. I needed a break from the chaotic mayhem of daily life, to breathe in some crisp fresh air, to get some quality sleep and exercise. I know I may sound incredibly selfish. My wife was also having a tough time, and I realised that. But I figured if I had some rest, I'd be able to help her out better with the baby later on. One thing I did know was we couldn't go on like this anymore, or we'd be swallowed alive by our fatigation. Fortunately, I also made absolutely sure that I always had my backpack fully stocked up with freeze-dried food and drinks should me and my wife be seized with a spontaneous impulsive desire to go camping again. When I was younger, and the weight of the world was getting on top of me, I always liked to escape to the mountains. I remember when I was 18 years old, my parents actually thought I'd gone missing, as I'd taken off on a trip on the Appalachian Trail. They had absolutely no idea where I was. I think the note I left must have been blown out the window or accidentally thrown away with the trash, but I do remember leaving them a note. But they never believed my claims, thinking that only in hindsight was I exercising remorse when I suddenly realised the undue stress I'd actually caused them, as they had recruited search parties to look for me. I was so disappointed that they doubted me in this regard. As I drive along, I barely notice the scenery, as it's ambiguously bathed in a dark carpet of indeterminate obscurity, as the night has literally laid claim to the environment, swallowing its definitive details in a single gargantuan mouthful, and leaving behind the vague, rather shadowy silhouettes of the trees and vegetation, so that beyond my headlight that lights up the road ahead of me, complemented by a faint spattering of moonlight, I can barely see much at all. I arrive at Springer Mountain parking lot at about 3:30 in the morning and dutifully park my truck. I then climb in the back of my truck and throw out the sleeping bag. Once I'm lying beneath its warm folds, let's just say sleep confiscates my consciousness and consumes me within almost seconds, demanding that I'm lost in the world of dreams, where I can find the sweet bouquet of rejuvenation for my body. I am awoken in the morning by soft shafts of sunlight, sprinkling their warm rays over my eyes, nudging my cheeks. I wake up feeling incredibly cramped from sleeping in the back of the truck in an awkward position. I rise up out of my sleeping bag to stretch my legs and prepare for my hike. I was about to phone my wife to tell her that I was at Springer Mountain car park and was about to proceed on my merry way. I wanted to tell her that she could expect me back on Sunday evening. I also wanted to apologise profusely for our altercation, as I felt my behaviour towards her had been rather unreasonable. My heart sinks when I realised I'd left my cell phone at home. I was here now. I wasn't going to go back for it. It had taken me an hour to get here, and I assumed my wife would know I'd gone camping. She had seen me ambling off with my camping gear, so I knew she'd assume that I'd be back on Sunday night. She knew on Monday morning that I had some important meetings with overseas clients that I couldn't afford to miss, so I'd be back by then. It was a prepossessing day, dappled in a warm, inviting energy. Spring was on the horizon. The days were becoming gradually lighter and warmer. I proceeded along my journey. I was greeted to the dignified, lofty figures of the trees, rather like statuesque centaurians. They were still bare from their autumn shedding, their thin, bombastic tree trunks penciling up into the sky in an upward trajectory, although some tree trunks curvaceously bent over at interesting sculptural angles. I noticed the bougainvilleas were full of leaves, and there were some trees that had welcomed the spring earlier than most, their branches sprinkled with a vibrant leafy regalia. It looks as if within a couple of weeks the forest is going to come alive with blossom. The earthen floor is richly carpeted with deep heaps of crisp fallen autumn leaves. I'm following the White Blazer Trail, where I tend to go beyond Hawk Mountain Shelter and find somewhere off the beaten track to camp for the night. It was pretty cold at about 37 degrees, but I knew the day would gradually heat up, and as my body warmed, I was likely to be shedding some clothing pretty soon. I found myself encountering water crossings where ribbons of gurgling water ran through the trail, bespeckled with large rocks that rose through the water like unyielding water lilies, or the cobbles of an old-fashioned path that were very easy to navigate and cross over. The rugged trail embraced meandering rocky outcrops and embankments, but with so little underbrush, I was able to fully appreciate the dark tree limbs against the blue sky, which twinkled through the canopy in a beguiling, gleaming light. It felt so good to be here alone, with the tweets and trills of the forest birds, that easily uplifted my spirits. The only other noise I could hear was the thumping of my boots on the forest floor. It was wonderful to empty my thoughts, not to think about anything at all, apart from drinking in the breathtaking scenery and sipping the pleasant bouquet of the fresh air, laced with the scent of pine and earth. I crossed a narrow bridge over a beautiful stream, where tall trees stood like magniloquent giants over the water's edge, while it obsequiously swept over the rocky boulders at a boisterous speed. But things got a lot more dramatic when further along the trail I encountered a masterful waterfall, where fast-flowing white water energetically cascaded over the rocky outcrops with a high-spirited ebullience, thundering down the woodland trail, crashing over other rocks with a rambunctious tenacity that knew no restraint. I sat down at this point to refresh myself with some liquid sustenance. A bottle of Mountain Dew that was warm but refreshing. I finally reached the Hawk Mountain shelter, where there are several little tents camped out there in the late afternoon, and an ablution block for campers to use. I couldn't wait to get away from this place as fast as I possibly could. I didn't want to be around other people. I wanted to spend some lonesome quality time with myself, to reconnect with nature, so I deliberately moved way off the beaten track. I know the trail incredibly well, so I'm not afraid of getting lost. In the morning I'll have to walk back the way I came. It's a pity that I can't be here longer, but it can't be helped. I'm needed back in the offices on Monday and Tuesday, and if I don't return home tomorrow, I know my wife will worry about me. I bask in the pleasantness of the late afternoon, when the sun begins to set. Its bright tangerine beams penetrate the canopy, covering all the scenery in a shimmering glaze. I quickly set up my tent for the night, where I found a fabulous clearing overlooking the stream that literally crashed over the rocks, making such a soothing, comforting sound. I put some bottles of Mountain Dew in this ice-cold water for it to get lovely and cold. I gather some firewood and collect some water to make myself a meal. My body is aching all over after the arduous trek, but I feel invigorated, refreshed and inspired. The day has been marvellously beautiful, the scenery arresting, and although I feel exhausted in a good way, as if the stress of the last few months has been wiped away. I realise how much I needed this adventure, how I wish my wife could be here with me right now. She would have loved this. I try not to think about her, as I know that I will be filled with guilt and self-loathing, and that will ruin the tranquillity of this blissful moment. I have in mind when I get home I will have a lot of making up to do, flowers to buy, a date night to organise, and a babysitter are almost certainly on the cards, and maybe even a weekend away without the baby. I could get my mother to take care of our child. Before long I have a fire going, and the water boiling in a pot. I watch the flames crackling, spitting. It audaciously burns the dry wood I collected with a zealous vigour. The fire is pleasingly warm, since the temperature has dropped significantly. There's an icy chill in the air. Some of the tree branches are jiggling in the breeze, while a soft moonlight twinkles through the branches. It's a beautiful night, serenaded by the sounds of crickets and frogs, and the occasional owl. I prepare myself my freeze-dried meal, reminding myself to get this flavour again. It's chicken a la king with rice, and it's absolutely delicious. But then again, when you're tired and hungry, everything tastes good under the stars. But I bet in my kitchen at home it wouldn't taste half as good. As the night rolls steadily forward, I feel my tiredness hijack my attention, as my lids involuntarily begin to close, and like a wilting alpine flower in the meadow, I move over to my sleeping bag, and the moment I hit the pillow, I immediately slip off into a peaceful slumber. I'm awoken in the middle of the night to blowing sounds, mouth clicks and grunts. Instead of reacting in a way the sharper version of myself would have done, I quickly retreat out of my tent, flashing my torchlight around, and that's when I see the largest black bear I've ever seen in my life. This bear is as large as a grizzly, without exaggeration. It's enormous. It does not possess the reticence of many black bears I've encountered before. They will often run away from human beings. The creature becomes incensed when the light of my torch bounces over his face. It runs towards me on all four legs, ambushing me, bounding over to me. The creature snarls, bares its teeth, and then stands up on its hind legs. My heart is thundering. I want to scream. I want to run, but I can't. The bear grabs me, flings me onto the ground, He's biting me with his canine teeth, lashing out at me with his sharp claws. The pain is excruciating as every muscle in my body cringes from this unfortunate attack. I decide to play dead, clasping my hands over my head and acting like I'm no longer in life. I loosen my arms and body so that it flops like a rag doll. But this grunting creature is not easily fooled. He continues to lash out at me, biting into my flesh, tearing into me with his claws. I am now absolutely certain I'm living on borrowed time. I'm not going to survive this surreal event. I quickly think back to the camping site. It's funny what you think about when you're about to face your death. I privately sniggered about thinking how glad I was not to be camping with all those people. Now the idea of having camped there holds great appeal to me, but it's all too late. I'm about to die. All I can think of is my beautiful wife, and even our screaming baby doesn't seem quite so bad after all. I have no doubt I'm going to not survive this altercation. That's when I hear a low, deep, guttural growl. My first thought is that this night could not get any more worse, even if it tried. I had dreadful visions of a mountain lion loitering in the shadowy undergrowth, only too eager to finish off what the bear had started. Could things get any worse than this? I didn't think so. "Please, God," I cry out in my heart, "please don't let me die. Please help me. Please, I can't die." I hear a loud growl again, and then this most raucous scream that sounds like a woman being murdered. The bear takes off in a frantic frenzy. Unfortunately, after the heavyweight lashings I received across my head, at this crucial point in time, I'm beginning to see stars. But I'm still aware of my surroundings, and of course of what has just transpired. And my body feels as battered as an old camping chair that has lost all its bones. I sense this tall, rather lofty creature hovering over me, her eyes filled with concern as she examines me. I catch a glimpse of this human-looking face staring down at me, and I'm immediately filled with a tranquil peace. The next thing I know is that this idiosyncratic creature, with a human-looking face, bundles me into her arms and carries me gently. I don't feel any jolts or bumps, because if I did, I know it would have been agonizing. I'm so tired. I don't need to keep fighting anymore, I tell myself. I can surrender to sleep, because I'm just so tired, so very, very tired. Over the course of that week, I have no concept of time, as days drifted into days and nights slipped by very fast. I was only vaguely aware of my environment when I had a sense that there were people around me who spoke in a strange foreign language that I was not familiar with. It sounded like an ancient dialect that incorporated many cliques. It was a male and female that were talking together. Their voices were earnest, and I sensed they were talking about me. These people loved to engage in conversation, which was intense, for they had a lot to say. I could often feel hands on my body, and something was constantly being rubbed over my wounds that would rarely sting. Even though I was so out of things, I was aware of all these sensations. I also would find honey water being dribbled on my tongue, and then this bitter stuff that tasted vile was also put into my mouth. I had the sense I was lying on something rather soft in a dark, airy room, where a light would creep in during the morning, casting its soft shadows. I would be covered with something warm that didn't smell too pleasant, but it certainly kept the cold out, and I could feel a fire crackling away not too far from me, filling this room with warmth. I knew it was a fire because I could hear the cracks and the spits and the hisses that you get from a fire. I was also comforted by the voices in the background, reminded me that wherever I was perfectly safe. I was sentiently heedful and cognizant of my surroundings, rather like a blind person might be aware of the space they occupy, without actually seeing a single thing. Sometimes your senses can actually do the seeing for you. Let's just say I remained sufficiently disconnected that I couldn't waken from my slumber, although I could move my hands and feet, but it was like the lights in my house were permanently off during this rather mysterious, baffling period. I was unconscious for most of this time, so much so that my moments of perceptive awareness were rather brief. I didn't think about my wife, my baby, my job, my home, or even my life. In truth, I'm not sure I remembered my past, and I couldn't even consider a future or recall my own name, which was rather confusing. But I remember accepting that conundrum, as if it really didn't matter a jot. I didn't worry or fret about insignificant concerns. In this very relaxed, tranquil, peaceful state of mind, I existed in the present moment, and accepted everything that was happening around me, although I didn't understand or comprehend it at all. There was one wakeful moment that I woke up, and was sure I must be dreaming. I found myself staring up at the rocky sculptural walls of a cave. It was dark in the cave, but a light in the ceiling from a sizable crack filtered in the room. I looked down at myself to discover I was covered in what I'm convinced was a bear pelt that smelt really mink, but it was lovely and warm. The floor of the cave was covered in animal skins, and there was a circular fire pit placed directly under the crack in the cave wall, in order to allow the smoke from a fire to rise through the crevices. I noticed there were large sculptural stones in the cave that looked like they were being used as chairs and tables. I remember thinking to myself that my comprehensible dream was so much more effulgently lucid than my usual dreams are. I never wanted to wake up from this dream. It was so wonderful. I could smell, feel, and see in this dream in such vivid detail, although I could sense the uncomfortable spasms of pain in my body, and those I did not appreciate. I looked down on myself to see that my bed is made up of thousands of leaves that have been pressed down with animal pelts. It is then that I see this bed is like a king-size bed, and at its furthest end is a large black bundle that's lying in a fetal position. For a second, I think that creature must be a bear. The creature is a light sleeper because it rises up on 2 feet and steadily walks over to me. It's 8 foot tall, 600 to 700 pounds, covered in long flowing hair that is as dark as a raven's feathers. The creature has small pert breasts, overlong arms, and is built so powerfully. I'm convinced she could actually lift up a car without even breaking a sweat. I look at the creature in confounded confusion, as I realise my dream is becoming so much more dramatic. Then I realise that what I'm seeing is a Bigfoot that is staring down at me, with bright brown eyes that look delighted to see that mine have finally opened. But I close my eyes again, drifting off into sleep, believing that what I've observed had to have been a dream. I hear the unorthodox creatures talking excitedly among themselves. They're talking about me. I'm sure of that. I begin to wake up more and more frequently and become more aware of my surroundings. I realise I'm sharing a cave with a male and female Bigfoot, and as bizarre as this may sound, it feels like the most natural thing in the world. I have fleeting memories that come back to me in waves, like a shoe being swept in by the current on a sandy beach, and you look at it and say, "That's a shoe." And then another high tide comes in, and it's a pair of swimming goggles, and you say, "Those are goggles." And slowly but surely you try to fit the jumble of puzzle pieces together in your mind. But it's all rather confusing, and when I think too much, my head begins to throb violently. The male and female Bigfoot live in this cave together. That's obvious. I think the female Bigfoot might be pregnant, as there's a very tiny bump in her stomach area, which she's always touching, like women do when they're pregnant. I know my wife did that a lot when she was. I have to say her gentleness towards me is remarkable. She's always touching me affectionately, and forever rubbing leaves on my skin, and giving me this foul green liquid to drink. She mixes it up in an old Coca-Cola bottle, crushing the leaves with a stone until they become a mush, and then she blends them with the water. I keep pushing her away when she puts the bottle to my lips, but she's very insistent that I swallow the liquid, pointing to my wounds. So I know she must have some kind of understanding of indigenous plants. So I obediently drink the vile concoction. In another bottle she puts a piece of honeycomb in it with water and shakes it up for me to have a drink. She gives me another bottle for my pee, which she discreetly discards. In the evening she cooks fish or deer on the fire and gives me the cooked flesh to eat. And even without salt, the meat is delicious. It filters through the cave with a wonderful aroma. I'm surprised the Bigfoots know about cooking meat, but I've also seen the female eating a dead squirrel completely raw. The male Bigfoot is a lot more evasive and reserved than the female. He likes to keep his distance from me, watching me with a wary reticence, as if to say, What on earth did the wife bring in here?
I'm not sure he's desperately comfortable with my presence in the cave. He watches me warily, as if he's not entirely sure that I can actually be trusted. The two Bigfoots sometimes have little spats together, but I sense the male knows better than to rile the female up. She's definitely the dominant one in the relationship, and keeps pointing to her stomach when the male begins to upset her. He then looks bashful, and becomes more cooperative and amenable. They spend a lot of time in the cave during the day sleeping, but in the late afternoons, evenings, and early mornings, they often go out. One day I wake up feeling pretty certain I'm absolutely fine. I remember my name, my wife, my baby, and I know that I need to get home. I indicate to the female and male Bigfoot that I want to go home. It's funny, but when I speak to them in English, they seem to understand exactly what I'm saying. They seem to have the ability to read my mind when they look into my eyes, but they don't seem happy about letting me go. Well, put more simply, the male is very happy about me going, very eager in fact, but not the female. He'd like to release me from the cave at once. He's telling the female that I should go, but the female is not happy about this at all. She points to my head, to the bruises, and shakes her head as if saying no. I then tell her I have a baby at home that I need to get to, and everything shifts after that. She understands, so she nods. The husband offers to take me down from the cave. The female agrees. She hangs her head sorrowfully, patting my back gently, and the male throws me on his back like a sack of potatoes and takes me directly back to my camping spot, where I find my tent and my backpack. It must have been an hour or so after the Bigfoot had left that I lose my memory all over again. I can't even remember what my name is anymore, and I feel so confounded, so confused, I'm wandering around in a dither. Niles' account. Me and my wife were on the Appalachian Trail on day 2. We were leaving the Hawks Mountain camp shelter, where we'd camped overnight. We'd been having a pleasant camping trip. The weather was terrific, although the nights and mornings were rather cold. We'd been walking for a long time over the earthen trail, and the green shoots of spring were rambunctiously weaving their way through the scenery. It was in the morning we encountered the stranger on the trail, that looked like he'd been attacked by a wild animal, most likely a bear. He was covered in scratches and bruises, his eyes swollen and black, and there was dried blood on his scalp and plenty of missing hair. Some of his injuries had been healing well. His skin was covered with a green hue, the colour of grass, as if he'd been rubbing green stuff all over it. I noticed his clothes were ruffled. There were deep rips in the fabric that looked like sharp claws had torn through it quite badly. I noticed he smelt a bit ripe, not to put too fine a point on it, as if he hadn't had a bath for quite a long time. But stranger than that, he was walking as if he was not completely compos mentos. He seemed disorientated, befuddled, very confused, as if he was in a maze looking for his way out and didn't know where to go. I sensed he didn't know even who he was. It was clear to me that he needed our help. We couldn't leave this man on the trail in such a befuddled state, or he could come to serious harm. "Are you all right, sir?" says my wife. The man looked at my wife with a puzzled expression and said, "Do I know you?" "No, we haven't met. Do you know what your name is?" "I can't remember. It slipped my mind, but I'm sure it'll come back to me. I did remember it earlier on, but I've lost track of it right now." "Do you know where you are from?" I asked him. "I'm not sure," he said. "It looks kind of familiar, but I'm not sure how to get home." We couldn't get any cell phone reception for some reason, so me and my husband decided we would take the stranger back to our truck and take him to hospital. I'm a nurse, my husband is a doctor, so after my husband examined him, we felt he was well enough to walk back to the truck. I noticed he was walking with a limp, but he seemed relatively nimble on his feet, so we went right back to the truck. It took us a long time to get there. I was worried about this gentleman's amnesia, but I knew after tests at the hospital we could find out what was going on with him. During our walk back to the parking lot, he would have brief moments when he would remember his name. Then 10 minutes later he'd forgotten it all over again. He told us he had a wife and baby. My husband suspected he might have been attacked by a bear. By nature, black bears can be rather reticent and tend to avoid human beings, but they will attack if they feel threatened, especially a mother protecting her cubs.
We were to learn later that Graham was indeed attacked by a rather belligerent black bear, a very big one. When me and my husband returned to the Appalachian Trail, we found the camping place where Graham had camped out. We made a special effort to look for it, and it was way off the beaten track. It could have remained there for years, clandestinely hidden from all passing campers, who would probably stick to the trail, fearing that if they didn't, they'd get lost. You do get a select few people like Graham, an intrepid adventurer determined to explore the natural world solo. But that comes with some ominous risks and consequences. Alas, a lot can go wrong when you're all on your own. And to top it all up, he did not even have a cell phone with him, which I gather he'd left at home. Graham was a victim of his exhausted state, which revealed to me he wasn't actually mentally equipped to go on this camping trip, as a fatigued body is a body that is slow to react to perilous danger. Let's just say his camping spot was a sight for sore eyes. His backpack had been ripped to shreds, all the food had been taken, and his utensils were lying littered all over the ground, including his bear spray and a rifle that hadn't been touched. We did discover some ice-cold bottles of Mountain Dew propped up in the cold water, and those were the most refreshing drinks we had on that trail. If you stumbled across this haunting sight without knowing what had happened, it would be an airy sight to behold. You would be left with the horrifying impression that something quite dreadful had happened here. I do understand why Graham wanted to camp off the beaten track. Really, I do. But I wouldn't do it myself, especially if a territorial creature like a bear got very upset by my presence. Having said that, if you have a rifle and accessible bear spray on hand, you should be all right. But my advice to you is don't embark on any journey when you're too exhausted. I have seen in my line of work how exhaustion can cause all kinds of accidents, and Graham's exhaustion meant he was slow to react appropriately when the bear came into his camp. By all accounts, his fatigued state could have been his greatest undoing. All I can say is things could have ended rather tragically for him. Thank goodness they didn't. The man is lucky to be alive. Back to Graham's wife. As you can imagine, my husband's revelations about being taken care of by a Bigfoot family after being rescued from a bear attack seemed hard to fathom, but I knew my husband wasn't making the story up, which I unequivocally believe to be the truth, and I believe the female Bigfoot saved his life. So there you are, that's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel, and my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 13 years old in 1993, and had such a profound dramatic effect on my life that it even influenced the direction of my life path in later years. I'm now a firm, staunch believer that there is no such thing as coincidence in this world, and that my interaction with this extraordinary creature was not an act of random chance, but a part of the great universal grand design and divine plan of the rich, vibrant tapestry of our human experience that I believe was clearly mapped out for me, possibly before I was even born. I believe we're all here to have a human experience in our physical bodies, and that our life paths lead us to those experiences that are often propelled by the life choices we choose to make and the roads we embark upon. In my opinion, nothing is ever an accident, because whether an experience turns out to be good or bad, inevitably we are being chiselled and moulded to become the very best versions of ourselves, and the unique individuals that we were clearly ordained to be. The more we spiritually evolve as human beings, the more enlightened, compassionate and loving we invariably become. Well, that's my belief anyway. I grew up in West Virginia with my older brother Nicholas and my younger sister Kate, and we grew up in an idyllic rural location not too far from the town of Charleston, and we lived in an exquisitely picture-perfect log cabin nestled in the heart of the emerald green valley and surrounded by a backdrop of the most gorgeous panoramic mountainous views and dreamy forests that literally stretched back for miles. I considered myself to be the luckiest girl in the entire world to grow up in such an extraordinary, beautiful, idyllic, heartwarming and magical place. My two siblings and I would spend the hot summer days cooling down in the woods, where the canopy of large trees would block out the heat of the day and allow just enough sun to dapple the forest floor in a very pretty light. I would play with my 2 siblings in the woods for hours on end, and we would play games like hide and seek, or even kick a ball around in the open clearing, and it was always the best place in the world to search for Easter eggs or to have picnics during the summer. We were fortunate because there was a gorgeous stream that travailed through the woods with a swift, forceful current that was surrounded by very large, imposing rocky boulders that were so magnificent that they looked like large works of art, and some were covered with beautiful layers of green moss. My all-time favourite spot to frequent in the woods was the enchanting rock pool with its imposing gushing waterfall, and as kids we would swim in that clear water almost every day during the summer months, often joined by other local kids who thought the woods on our land were like a piece of heaven. Naturally, living in this idyllic part of the world, we were exposed to the indigenous wildlife, and as invariably with such a great water supply meandering through the woods, it did attract a large deer population, including the inevitable raccoons and squirrels. It would seem that nobody hunted in our family, and I believe the animals saw our property as a safe retreat. Growing up, my mother stayed at home taking care of us and manning the fort, while my father worked in Charleston as a banker. One day when I was about 13 years old, I remember my brother and sister were doing their homework in the kitchen under my mother's supervision. As I'd finished my homework, I had some free time on my hands. It was a very sweltering hot day, and I decided I wanted to read a book. I remember it was an exciting mystery novel, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. But I decided I'd go and read it in the woods, because it was so refreshingly cool and breezy in there, and besides, I loved being outdoors. I grabbed a bottle of fresh spring water and a picnic rug, and off I went. I remember laying the picnic blanket underneath an oak tree, and I began to read my book. I took a sip of water and looked up from my book for a moment, and that was when I saw this huge pile of what I can only describe looked like an old dirty grey rug that was lying under this tree. I remember wondering who had thrown it out, and why they had tossed it in the woods like that. It was very peculiar because our land was private property, so I did not know of anyone who would be throwing nasty old rugs in the wood, unless there was a vagrant trespassing on our land, and this would not be the first time that had happened to us. I took another sip of water, and then I remember being almost convinced that the strange rug had curiously moved. Suddenly I was absolutely certain that there was someone sleeping under that dirty old rag. I knew my dad would not be happy to learn about another annoying trespasser that we would invariably have to chase off our land. Feeling more than a little cheesed off by this unwelcome visitor, I ventured towards the old smelly rug, and almost gagged because it smelt so disgusting and vile. I tugged the rug violently with my hands, and realised that the rug seemed to be attached to a living creature. I was completely gobsmacked and mesmerised at the same time. I could not imagine what it was, because it was large enough to be a bear, but this was clearly no bear, and it was too big to be a grey shaggy dog. I was very confused. Suddenly the creature looked up at me with what I can only describe as these bright yellow alluring eyes that peered at me through a sea of grey hair. On closer inspection, and to my utter amazement, I realised that this critter had human-like characteristics, but it wasn't human, and ape-like characteristics, but it wasn't an ape. I'd never seen, nor had I ever heard of a creature like this before, but whatever it was, it clearly needed me. I could sense that the creature was so ecstatic to see me, and seemed reassured by my presence, as if in some way I brought him a measure of great comfort. I could see the critter was beyond help. It was an elderly male, and I knew instantly that it was dying. I have been around dying animals enough in my young life, living so close to nature as I did, that I knew the imminent signs before me. I put my hand on the creature and stroked his hair tenderly, and the gratitude I witnessed on its face was immeasurable. I knew it did not want to be alone, as he lay there, and who could blame him? I sat beside him, putting my hand on his colossal, emaciated body and stroking him very gently. I could feel and sense his gratitude as he let out a few grunts under his breath. I began to sing to him very gently, and he seemed soothed by my voice. When he groaned in pain, he clutched an area of his body, and that was when I would massage the tender spot ever so lightly with my hands. I kept saying to him, "It's going to be all right, just you see. I promise you, it's going to be all right." I spoke to him in very gentle whispers. "It's going to be all right. Everything's going to be fine. I promise you. Don't you worry. Everything's going to be fine." I do not want to underestimate how Herculean this thing was. It was almost like I was stroking a rhino or a blue whale, something with an extensive surface area that had very titanic proportions. I could tell that the critter was suffering from extreme muscle wastage and was skeletal, scrawly, decrepit and weathered by the ravages of a very long life. I think he must have just suddenly passed out and stumbled under the tree where I found him, and his body began to shut down. I was so pleased to be with him in these last moments because his family possibly hadn't realised his impending fate. I imagine he was engaging in his usual routine and was struck down very suddenly, and as far as his family members were concerned, I imagine they were oblivious of his dramatic physical decline and deterioration. If they could not be there for him, at least I was. I remember grabbing the strange critter's hands, but they were so big that I could only squeeze a couple of his sausage-sized fingers, and when I did this, he made this very thankful grunt, as if I was reassuring him and watching over him. I know it sounds very odd, but I felt such a connection towards this creature. Possibly it was because of his humanness in the appearance, but somehow I felt such extraordinary love and compassion for him. This hairy humanoid opened its gorgeous golden eyes and looked at me with such incredible warmth. I kept reassuring him over and over again with soothing, calming words. I could feel the tears welling up in the back of my eyes, because I didn't want this extraordinary, unique and special beast to die. I think he sensed my shriveled, distraught emotions, because he reached out to touch me, as if to reassure me, which was so endearing that I was touched to the quick. I mean, this creature was dying, for goodness sake, and it was actually trying to soothe me and calm me down. I opened my bottle of water and poured a little down its throat, which seemed to quench his dry throat, and he drank the cold liquid gratefully, all the while watching me with curious eyes. "I do not know what you are, or who you are," I told him, "but I know that you are very beautiful and very special, and I know that I shall never forget you as long as I live." I said this, cradling my body close to the creature's, as if I'd known it all my life. "I may have only met you a second ago," I told him, "but I love you, and I always will." I knew he wanted me there, and I was so happy to be there for him. I put my hand on his thin, sinewy expanse of broad chest, and I could feel the heart beating very slightly, like a battery that's running out of steam, and growing fainter and fainter and fainter by the second. I knew it wouldn't be long now before he finally breathed his last. I nudged the creature very gently and looked at him tenderly, and for a moment our eyes met. "It won't be long now," I said reassuringly. "Then you'll be going off to a wonderful, beautiful place." The creature grunted as if he understood my words, breathed his last, and finally he slipped away and died. I remember bursting into tears and shaking his body as violently as I could to try and wake him up and rouse him from his sleep, but he was well and truly deceased, and his body lay limp. I checked his chest, and his heartbeat had definitely stopped. So I ran back to the house, sobbing my heart out, inconsolable with grief, as if I had lost my best friend. My mother and brother could not get anything out of me, as I was so terribly upset. I remember my mother said, "Rachel, you're scaring me half to death. Has someone died?" I nodded my head and beckoned for them to follow me back into the woods, but when I returned to the place where I had discovered this extraordinary creature under that tree, his body had mysteriously been evacuated. It was utterly extraordinary, and I was so devastated. "It was here," I said, "a moment ago. It was here. I was here with it." "What was here?" my mother asked, looking mortified. "Rachel, you're scaring me. What was here?" I proceeded to tell them my strange, very peculiar story, and they both looked very perturbed. "Rachel," my mother said, "I've no idea what you saw, because I've never heard of such a creature before. But I'm glad you were there for it in its last moments. No one should ever have to die alone, human or animal. I remember hearing my brother say to my mother, "What the heck did she see?" "I have absolutely no idea," remarked my mother. "But I'll tell you this for nothing. I've never seen Rachel so emotionally stirred up by anything like this before. This event has impacted her life in such a dramatic way. You mark my words." My mother was right, of course. After my interaction with the critter in its dying moments, I was moved so much that I decided when I grew up, I wanted to become an EMT. I wanted to help people in harrowing emergency situations and be that reassuring voice for them, especially if they were in death and life situations. I now vehemently believe that the creature I encountered in the woods was, in fact, a Bigfoot. Fast forward a few years and I had trained as an EMT. I still remember the first day of my course as if it was yesterday. There were so many young people, equally as enthusiastic and eager to become EMTs as I was. We were all talking excitedly about the prospects of the job. I still remember the doctor coming into the room with a very sombre expression and telling us that he was going to show us a graphic video about life on the front line dealing with emergency situations, which he warned us was not for the faint-hearted. "Once you've seen the video, and you still want to be an EMT," he told us, "then and only then will I believe you. The job requires nerves of steel." He pointed to a pile of plastic bags. "If any of you need to throw up during the footage," he explained, "they're there for you." I remember thinking, what the heck? How could a video really be that horrific that we might actually need sick bags? Wasn't that not going a little bit overboard? The footage was worse than I could have ever envisaged, and we were eyewitness to the raw emotions, the screaming relatives, and of course all the grisly details of decapitated body parts, from shootings, car accidents, and of course suicides. We were shown details of the bodies in graphic detail, like the tissues, the blood, the goo, the brain matter, that had all been splattered across the road in an accident, like a box of broken eggs. It didn't get more graphic than that. I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I was all stoic and composed, because like most of the people in the room, I was actually throwing up violently and heaving in a sick bag. But if the video could not have got any worse, it invariably did, and we were seeing graphic scenes of EMTs being beaten up by drunks and physically assaulted in their jobs, which is part of the job description. And I watched all this with great trepidation. When the doctor finally returned back into the room, he asked us if anyone wanted to leave, and more than half of the potential applicants left at once, realising that they could never stomach a job in the front line. I remember the doctor smiling at us and saying, "You see why my job is so easy? Because now I know who's got what it really takes to do the job, without wasting my time with interviews." I think we were being shown this footage to see whether we had the grit and the steel to be able to deal with these challenging life and death situations, and I can assure you that nothing you could have said would have put me off becoming an EMT, because I was absolutely determined to follow what I believed was my life calling. I was to discover that being an EMT was such a rich, intimate experience for me, helping people in all kinds of scenarios, such as deadly car accidents, suicides, assaults, murders and shootings, and believe me, I saw it all. And even the video didn't do justice to what it really was like out there in those harrowing life and death situations, because believe me, it's graphic, it's bloody, and it's horrendous. As is the case with every EMT, there is usually a story that they will never ever forget. And my special story I'd like to share with you and your listeners that I really believe affirms that there really is life after death. So here is my story. It all happened when I was called out to an area in Charleston at about 9 o'clock at night. It appeared that a very young woman had been shot in the leg by her fiancé, who claimed it had been a dreadful accident. When we arrived at their Charleston home, the boyfriend was so inconsolable with grief and was sitting on the porch crying. He kept saying, "It's my fault, it's my fault, it was an accident, please help her," he begged. I looked at the girl and she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm so scared," she said. "I'm sure I'm going to die. Please, please, don't let me die." I remember my hands were shaking violently
as I tied a tourniquet on her leg. I could see blood was spraying out of her femoral artery at an alarming rate. "You're going to be fine," I kept reassuring her, although in my gut I knew things weren't looking at all good. The whole patio floor was covered in pools of blood, and I know it sounds weird, but I could actually taste and smell the iron in the air. At this stage my gloved hands were sliding and slipping all over the place from the blood, and my patient started slipping into unconsciousness as my partner was incubating her. I was tightening the tourniquet on her leg because the wound had not stopped bleeding. It was really out of control. Suddenly I heard this loud whooshing sound, which was so audible to me, and I kid you not, I saw the apparition of this woman slide out of her body, much like a card from an envelope. The next thing I knew was that she was seated on the ground, leaning over her body and staring down at herself. I remember she looked startled when she realised she was outside of her body, and she was watching us. She was surprised that we could actually see her. I will never forget her pleading expression on her face as we worked on her, trying to stop the blood flow. I really believe she wanted to live. I've never seen anything like this happen before, and I couldn't make any sense of it at all. Even my EMT partner witnessed this tumultuous event, and we kept working on the poor woman while she watched us so earnestly. But unfortunately we couldn't save her in time, because everything transpired way too quickly, and she'd lost far too much blood. Suddenly the apparition of the girl vanished before us, and we had to cover up her whole body with a sheet. I kept wondering if she was still watching us, and it sent chills down my spine because I could sense and feel her around us. "Life extinct," I said, 9:06 p.m. "Did you see that?" I asked my partner, shaking. "The girl was outside her own body. She was watching us." "Like hell I saw it," said my partner, looking at me with wide eyes. "We saw her ghost. She wanted to live, poor thing, but she's bled out so much we could never have saved her." Suddenly we saw the sobbing fiancé coming racing over to us. "What have you done?" he screamed, lashing out at me aggressively. "You let her die! You let her die! How could you? I trusted you!" He started slapping me very hard, in between violent sobs. "Sir," I said, "please sit down now. Calm down. I didn't kill your fiancé. I want to explain what happened. The bullet hit her femoral artery. She was bleeding out so fast, it was impossible to curtail the bleeding. There was nothing we could do, and the tourniquet was not working. I'm sorry, sir, but there was nothing we could do." "Oh, my God! What have I done?" said the fiancé. "It's my fault. It's my fault." "Now calm down," I said. "What happened? Do you remember?" I was showing my fiancé how to use the revolver. She's been stalked by a weirdo at work, and was certain this man was following her everywhere she went. I told her she needed to learn to use a revolver, and I kept going over and over what she needed to do, and I kept showing her over and over again. She really wasn't getting it easily. I began to show her the safety catch and how to pull the trigger. I kept repeating it, because she just couldn't get it into her head how to do it. I was pulling the trigger several times during my demonstration, and the one time when I failed to use the safety catch, the rifle unloaded in her leg. It was an awful mistake. I tried to calm the man down, but he didn't seem to be able to be calmed, because he was in such a terrible state. Later I watched him being led away by the police because they had to take him for some interrogation, because obviously he had actually shot her, so he was the prime suspect. "Do you really think it was an accident?" I asked my partner. "Who knows?" he said. "It's a funny old world, the things that happen out here. They boggle the mind. I wonder if people would believe some of our stories." "Probably not," I laughed. "I sincerely doubt it." "What do you think about the apparition we just saw?" I asked him. "I think it's proof beyond question that life beyond death really exists," he said. "I do not believe we actually die. We live on." So there you are. That's my story. I just want to say that that was the most incredible, incredible story. And I just want to thank you so very much for sending it to us and letting us really understand, Rachel, what it is like to be an EMT on the front line. That story of
that girl being outside of her body, looking down on herself, and you actually physically seeing her apparition is shocking. That really is quite something. That must have been very harrowing for you and very traumatic. And as for your encounter with the Bigfoot in the woods, I'm just so grateful that you had the courage and the strength to literally calm that creature down. A lot of people wouldn't have had that amount of courage. And I think when you went back to look for it, it had clearly been taken away by its loved ones who clearly discovered it deceased. It obviously lived a very long life, but you were able to literally tune in to its energy, and it appreciated that so very much. Because I agree with your mother. I don't think anybody would want to die alone. And I think we have an enormous amount in common with Bigfoots. Yes, you do get very aggressive ones out there, but this one was very, very amenable and very congenial. And what a wonderful encounter.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.